Look what the wind blew in. The words hit like a slap across an empty room. 3 ranch hands laughed, loud, cruel, aimed at an old man with a scar down his face who hadn't said a single word yet. He didn't flinch. He just walked slow, deliberate to the far corner of the shop. Back against the wall, eyes already counting exits nobody else in that room had thought to notice. Because in exactly 45 minutes, a killer was riding into town to finish what started 14 years ago. And the old farmer they were laughing at, he'd already buried 6 men who made that same mistake. The shop owner walked in a moment later, took one look at the stranger in the corner, and the color drained clean out of his face. "Boys," he said, voice shaking, "get out now." Nobody in that room yet understood exactly what kind of morning they had just walked into, but they were about to. The town of Larkspur Hollow did not wake up slow that morning. It woke up wrong. Dust hung low over the main street, thick and gold, unmoving. No wind, no birds calling from the eaves of the mercantile. Just silence, the kind that presses against a man's chest before he even understands why. Old-timers would say later they felt it in their knees before they saw anything. A stiffness, a warning. The kind of mourning that made a dog stop mid-stride and turn its head toward nothing at all. Because something was coming. And Larkspur Hollow, without knowing it yet, had already started holding its breath. Walter Colby walked down that street alone, boots scraping wood. Slow, even. A man who had learned, a long time ago, that hurry gets you killed and patience gets you home. He was 60 years old, broad through the shoulders still, though age had started chipping away at the edges of him the way weather chips at rock. Not fast, just steady, relentless. A long scar ran from his left temple down through the edge of his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin. 14 years old, that scar. 14 years, and it still ached when the weather turned. He wore a canvas suit the color of dried mud, a hat pulled low, boots that had walked more miles than most men walk in 3 lifetimes. His hands were rough, cracked at the knuckles. Hands that had held a plow. Hands that had held a rifle. Hands that had held his wife's hand while she died and hadn't been fast enough to stop it. He didn't look at the shop fronts. Didn't look at the 2 women whispering by the well pump. Didn't look at anything except the door ahead of him. Colby's gun and iron. Painted letters, chipped at the edges. The same shop it had always been, ever since a younger version of Roy Whitfield had taken over from his own father. Walt stopped in front of it, just stood there a moment. Because there's a difference between walking towards something and walking into it, and he wanted, for one last second, to feel the difference. Then he pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang out into the morning like a small, brittle scream. Inside, the shop smelled the way it always had. Gun oil, old leather, sawdust. A smell that clung to the back of a man's throat and reminded him of every counter he'd ever leaned against, waiting for bad news or good. 2 young men stood near the register. Dale Prescott, lean, restless, the kind of handsome that hadn't yet been humbled by anything real. And beside him, younger, quieter Nate Sorensen, 22, still learning which of Dale's jokes were worth laughing at. They looked up when the bell rang. They looked at an old man in a dusty coat, and Dale laughed before Walt even got the door shut behind him. "Well, would you look at that?" Dale's voice carried, easy, mocking. Grandpa lost his way to the feed store. Nate snorted. Quick, automatic. The laugh of a young man who hadn't decided yet whether he agreed but wanted to belong. Walt said nothing. He didn't look at them either. Not yet. Instead, his eyes moved. Fast. Practiced. The kind of glance that takes in everything and commits to nothing. The front door behind him. The window to his left. The gap where the counter ended. And a curtain hung over a back room. The distance between himself and every hard surface in the building. Old habit. Older than the scar. Older, maybe, than the war he'd fought before most of these boys were born. He crossed the floor toward the far corner. Not fast. Not slow. Just deliberate. Because a man who is only looking doesn't move that way. A man who is waiting does. Dale watched him go, grinning at Nate like he'd found something worth remembering for later. Worth telling the boys down at the saloon. "You lost, old-timer. Church is 2 blocks that way." Walt reached the corner, turned, put his back to the wall, and said in a voice that came out low, flat, unbothered, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Something in it made Nate's grin falter. Just slightly. A hitch. The kind of thing a young man feels before he understands why he's feeling it. Dale didn't notice. Or didn't care to. "What are you even here for, then?" Dale pushed off the counter, strolling closer with the loose confidence of a man who'd never once had to be afraid of anything in his own town. "We don't sell canes. Or rocking chairs." "I'm waiting," Walt said. "For what?" Walt didn't answer. The clock above the register ticked. Steady, patient, counting something neither boy understood yet. Because there are silences that fill a room the way sound never could. And this was one of them. Near the rifle case at the far wall, a third man had gone very still. Amos Kettering. 68 years old, broad-shouldered even now, gray creeping through hair that had once been the color of wet iron. He'd been in the shop before Walt walked in, pretending to inspect a lever-action Winchester he had no real intention of buying. Old men did that sometimes. Came in just to touch something that reminded them of a younger version of themselves. But Amos wasn't looking at the rifle anymore. He was looking at the way the old farmer stood. Weight balanced, knees soft, shoulders square but not stiff. One hand resting near the edge of his coat, not gripping anything, just close. Close enough. Amos had spent 30 years of his life reading men like that. Reading which ones would run. Which ones would freeze. Which ones would, without flinching, do exactly what needed to be done and carry the weight of it quietly for the rest of their lives. This man, this weathered, scarred, unremarkable-looking farmer that two boys were laughing at, moved like the second kind, which meant Dale and Nate had no idea what they were laughing at. Amos set the rifle down. Slow, careful not to draw attention, and he watched, because something told him this morning wasn't going to end the way it started. The bell above the door rang again. Roy Whitfield stepped inside, carrying a small metal cash box under one arm, the way he did most mornings, the till from the previous night tucked against his ribs, like a habit older than thinking. 45 years old, solid, through the chest. A face that had spent years outdoors and hands that had, at some point in his life, learned to be steady no matter what they were holding. He took 2 steps into his own shop and stopped. His eyes found the man standing in the corner, and everything in him went still. The cash box tilted in his grip. Not far, not enough to spill, but enough. Enough that Dale glanced over, confused, because Roy Whitfield did not fumble things. Ever. Roy's face didn't show surprise exactly. It showed something heavier. Recognition. The kind that arrives all at once, 14 years late, and knocks the wind clean out of a man's chest before his mind even catches up to what his body already knows. "Walt," Roy said. Just that. Barely above a whisper. Dale turned fully now, frowning between them. "You two know each other?" Roy didn't answer him. He set the cash box down on the counter, slow, deliberate, the way a man sets down something when his hands can no longer be trusted to hold it right. Then he looked at Dale, at Nate, and something in his voice changed, dropped, hardened into something none of them had heard from him before. "Get out." Dale blinked. "What?" "Out now. Boss, we're just now." The word came flat. Not loud, it didn't need to be loud. Because there's a kind of quiet that carries more weight than shouting ever could. And Roy Whitfield, gun shop owner, church-going, easy-tempered, had just spoken in a voice that belonged to somebody else entirely. Somebody who used to give orders men followed without asking why. Dale's face flushed red. He looked at Nate like he expected backup. Got none. Nate was already moving toward the door. Because whatever Nate didn't understand about this morning, his body understood something, and it was telling him to leave. Dale followed, muttering something under his breath that nobody bothered to hear. The bell rang. The door swung shut behind them, and then there were 3 men left in the shop. Roy, Walt, and Amos, still standing quietly by the rifle case, suddenly very aware that he was witnessing something he had not been invited to. Roy crossed the floor, stopped about 10 feet from Walt, close enough to speak low, far enough to leave room for whatever this was. 14 years, Roy said. 14 years, Walt agreed. You look older, I am older. A small, broken kind of laugh escaped Roy. Not humor. Just pressure, finding a crack to leak out of. I used to think about you, Roy said. Wondered if you were even still. He stopped himself, because some sentences don't need finishing. Both men in that room understood exactly what word he'd swallowed. Walt's jaw tightened. Just slightly. I'm still here, he said. For now. Roy's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Walt didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze drifted briefly toward the front window, toward the empty street outside. The too quiet street. The kind of quiet a man learns to distrust. Because quiet out here was rarely just quiet, sir. Amos's voice, careful, from the far wall. I don't mean to intrude. Roy glanced at him. Something passed across his face, a decision being made. Then he nodded once. Amos Kettering, Roy said. Good man. Used to scout for the cavalry. Walt's eyes moved to Amos for the first time. Really looked at him. Measured him the way men measure each other when their lives might one day depend on the answer. Border campaigns, Amos said. Simple. Offering nothing more than he needed to. Something shifted behind Walt's eyes. Recognition, maybe. Respect, maybe. The kind that passes silently between two men who've both buried people they couldn't save. Then you understand, Walt said, why I'd rather you stepped outside for a spell. Amos held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. I'll be close, he said. Not a question. Not a request for permission. Just a fact, delivered plainly, the way old soldiers deliver facts that matter. He walked toward the door, boots quiet on the wood. But just before he reached it, he stopped. Didn't turn around. I don't know your name, Amos said. But I know how you're standing. And I've only ever seen men stand like that, when they've already decided something can't be talked out of them. Walt said nothing. Amos nodded once more, to no one in particular, and stepped outside. The bell rang. The door swung shut, and then it was just the two of them. Roy exhaled, long, shaking slightly at the edges. Say it, he said. Whatever it is, just say it. Walt looked at him for a long moment. Because there are things a man carries so long they stop feeling like weight and start feeling like bone. 14 years of it. 14 years of carrying a name he never wanted to speak out loud again. But some mornings, you have no choice. Vain, Walt said. The word landed in the room like a dropped stone. Roy's face went pale. Not confused. The opposite of confused. There's one left, Roy said. Not a question. There's one left. I thought Roy's voice cracked. Just slightly, before he caught it. Everyone thought that name was finished. That you'd finished it. 6 of them, Walt. 6. Everyone in 3 territories knows that story. Everyone was wrong. Silence again. The clock ticking. Dust drifting slow through the morning, light coming in sideways from the window. Roy sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter, like his legs had simply decided they were done holding him up. How long have you known? 3 weeks. And you didn't come to me sooner. Walt's hand drifted briefly, unconsciously, to the scar along his jaw. A gesture so old it had stopped being deliberate years ago. Didn't want you carrying it, Walt said before you had to. Roy stared at the scar, really looked at it, maybe for the first time in years, understanding suddenly that it wasn't just an old wound from an old story. It was recent. It was fresh in a way scars that old shouldn't be. He did that, Roy said. Quiet. Certain he did. When, Cheyenne? 3 weeks back. Roy's hands curled into fists on the counter. He had you. And he let you live. He wanted me to have time, Walt said. Time to think about it. Time to come here ready. Here, Roy repeated, and something in his voice cracked open with understanding. This shop. Because that was the cruelty of it, wasn't it? Not just revenge, theater. A stage chosen with care, chosen to mean something. Chosen because this was the place where 14 years ago a grieving widower had walked in and bought the gun that would go on to end 6 lives. Roy stood, paced 2 steps, stopped, ran a hand hard down his face like he could scrub the last 30 seconds out of his memory if he pressed hard enough. When, he said. Noon. Roy looked at the clock, did the math without wanting to. His face went even paler. I know what time it is, Roy. You could leave. Right now. Back door. Horse. You could be 10 miles from here before? No. Walt, I said no. The word came out harder than Walt meant it to. He softened just slightly, seeing what it did to Roy's face. I've been running from this for 3 weeks, Walt said. Quieter now. I'm done running. Roy's jaw worked, chewing on something he wanted to say, and wasn't sure he had the right to. After everything he finally managed. After 14 years of surviving what you survived, you're going to let it end here, in my shop. Because some ghost of a family you already buried decided he wants his turn. Walt's eyes, pale as winter sky, didn't waver. I'm not letting anything happen, he said. I'm finishing what got started a long time before either of us walked into this room today. Roy opened his mouth, closed it again, because he'd known this man 14 years. And in 14 years he had learned exactly one unbreakable truth about Walter Colby. Once his mind was made up, there was no talking him anywhere else. The clock ticked on. Outside, the street stayed empty. Too empty. The kind of empty that made the skin on the back of a man's neck stand up if he paid close enough attention. Roy walked to the window, looked out at nothing, at everything. Those boys, he said, without turning around. Dale, Nate, they don't know who you are. Good, Walt said. Let them keep not knowing a while longer. They mocked you. They're young. Does that bother you? It was quiet a moment. No, he said finally. It reminds me what I used to sound like, before I learned better. The hard way. Roy almost smiled at that. Almost. He turned from the window, looked at Walt standing there in the corner, back against the wall. And for the first time in 14 years, he let himself really see the man in front of him. Not the legend. Not the story people whispered at bar tops from here to the Wyoming line. Just a tired, aging farmer with a scar on his face and a hole in his chest the size of a woman he'd loved for 20 years and lost in a single, screaming night. I owe you my life, Roy said. Quiet. Certain. You know that. You don't owe me anything, I owe you everything. Walt shook his head. Slow. That convoy was 14 years ago, Roy. You've paid it back 100 times over just by living decent since. That's not how debts like that work. It's exactly how they work. Roy looked like he wanted to argue further. Didn't. Some men, faced with a debt they can never fully repay, learn to carry the weight of it quietly instead. Roy Whitfield was one of them. He straightened. Something in his posture hardened. I'm keeping the shotgun loaded behind the counter, he said. Just so you know. Roy, I'm not asking permission. Walt studied him a long moment, then slowly nodded. Just once. Because some fights a man can't talk his friends out of. He'd learned that lesson himself, more than once in more than one war. The morning wore on. Outside, the town went about its business, unaware. A wagon rattled past, wheels groaning over packed dirt. A woman crossed toward the mercantile, a basket on her hip, calling a greeting to someone Walt couldn't see. 2 children chased each other down the boardwalk, laughing, small and bright, and entirely unbothered by the weight settling over Larkspur Hollow like a held breath. Life continuing. Unaware that somewhere on the horizon something was riding closer with every passing minute. Walt watched it all through the window from his corner and felt something ache behind his ribs that had nothing to do with age. Because he remembered mornings like this. 14 years ago. Ordinary mornings. The kind that don't know yet they're about to become the last ordinary morning a man will ever have. Martha used to hum while she worked. He remembered that now, standing in a stranger's gun shop with death circling closer by the minute. The sound of her humming while she kneaded bread. Off-key. Always slightly off-key. He used to tease her about it. He would give anything at all, to hear it wrong one more time. Roy's voice broke through the memory. Careful. Gentle. You want to sit? There's a chair in the back. I'll stand. Walt, I said I'll stand. Because sitting felt like surrender. Felt like letting the weight of 14 years finally push him down into something soft, something comfortable, and he wasn't ready for comfortable. Not yet. Maybe not ever again. Roy didn't push it. Instead, he moved behind the counter, opened the drawer where he kept the ledger, and didn't write anything in it. Just needed his hands to be doing something. Anything. Tell me about him, Roy said after a while. The one who's coming. Walt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went distant. Cold. Youngest, he said. Different mother. raised apart from the rest of them. Nobody knew he existed. Not even the ones He stopped himself. Because there are sentences a man doesn't finish. Not out loud, not even to a friend. Not the ones I killed. Not the ones I hunted down one by one, across 3 territories, until there was nothing left of that family but silence and a scar on his own face to remember them by. How do you know all that? Roy asked. If nobody knew he existed. He told me. In Cheyenne. Before he cut me and let me walk away. Roy's hands stilled over the ledger. He talked to you? Before he wanted me to understand, Walt said. Wanted me to know exactly what was coming, and why, and who was bringing it. That's not revenge, Roy said slowly. That's something else. Walt nodded once. Grim. That's patience, he said. And patience is a far more dangerous thing than anger ever was. The bell above the door rang. Both men tensed. Roy's hand dropped instinctively toward the shotgun beneath the counter. But it was only Amos, stepping back inside, his face unreadable, his eyes sweeping the shop with the same practiced calm he'd carried since the moment he first laid eyes on Walter Colby. Street's clear, Amos said. For now, you didn't have to keep watch, Walt said. I know. Then why did you? Amos considered the question a moment, the way a man considers something he's never had to put into words before. Because 30 years ago, he said, I watched good men die in a mountain pass because nobody was keeping watch when it mattered. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake twice. He paused. I don't intend to start today. Something passed between the 2 older men. Unspoken. Understood. The particular kind of respect that only exists between people who've carried the same kind of weight, even if they never carried it together. Walt didn't argue further. The clock above the register read 11:15. 45 minutes. Roy's jaw tightened as he read it too. He walked to the front of the shop, checked the lock on the door out of habit, though he knew it wouldn't matter. Knew a locked door had never once stopped a man like the one riding toward them. I should close up, he said. Turn the sign. Keep folks from wandering in. No, Walt said. Roy turned, frowning. Why not? Because he wants this quiet. Wants it to look ordinary. If you close the shop, if the street empties out unnatural-like, he'll know something's wrong before he even gets here. And a man who's had 3 weeks to plan this, you don't want to give him a reason to change his plan. Roy's frown deepened, but he nodded slowly. Ordinary, he repeated. You want it to look ordinary. While we wait for a killer to walk through that door. That's exactly what I want. Aim. Ass moved to the window, positioning himself where he could see the street without being seen clearly from it. Old habits. Old instincts, older than most of the buildings in this town. You said Cheyenne, Amos said, without turning around. 3 weeks back. That's right. That's a long ride from here. He's had time to plan the route. Time to think about every mile of it. And you, Amos said. What have you had time to think about? Walt was quiet a long moment. Whether I still have it in me, he finally said. To do what needs doing. Whether 14 years of farming quiet has worn away whatever it was that let me survive the first 6. And what have you decided? Walt's eyes drifted to the window, to the empty street, to the sun climbing slow and merciless toward its highest point. I've decided it doesn't matter what I've decided, he said. Noon is coming whether I'm ready or not. The words settled over the room like dust. Outside, somewhere beyond the edge of town, a road stretched west into low hills and scrub pine, empty for now, but not for long. Somewhere along that road a rider moved at an unhurried pace. A man in no rush at all, because a man who has waited 2 years for something rarely feels the need to hurry through the final hour of it. He did not know yet what waited for him inside Colby's gun and iron. He did not know about Roy Whitfield's debt, 14 years old and still unpaid in his own mind no matter what Walt said. He did not know about Amos Kettering, standing watch at the window, a man who had buried too many friends to let one more death happen on his watch without at least trying to stand between it and the people who didn't deserve it. He knew only one thing, and it was enough to keep him riding steady through the gold morning light. That somewhere ahead of him, in a shop that had once sold a grieving widower, the gun that ended his family, that same widower now stood waiting. 14 years in the making. 1 hour left to go. Inside the shop, Walt reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a small leather pouch worn soft with age, the stitching along one seam beginning to fray. He set it on the edge of a wooden barrel near where he stood and opened it slowly. Bullets, brass, clean, catching the light. He didn't load them. Not yet, just counted them one by one, the way a man takes inventory of exactly how much life he has left to spend. Roy watched him do it, throat tightening. He'd seen men prepare for battle before. Had done it himself once, a long time ago, in a different uniform, under a different name. Before a bad winter, and a woman who rode out of a snowstorm changed the entire shape of what his life was going to become. But there was something about watching this particular man, this quiet, scarred, aging farmer counting bullets in the corner of an ordinary gun shop on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that made the whole thing feel heavier than any battlefield Roy had ever survived. How many? Roy asked quietly. Did it take? The first time? All of them. Walt didn't look up from the pouch. 6, he said. 18 months. 3 territories. And you found everyone. I found everyone. Was it worth it? Walt's hands stilled over the bullets. He looked up then, and something moved behind his pale eyes. Something old and tired and honest in a way that most men only allow themselves to be once or twice in an entire lifetime. Ask me again in an hour, he said. Roy didn't press further. There was nothing left to press against. Just a clock, ticking steady toward noon, and a man counting bullets like prayers. The door rattled. Not the bell. The door itself, tested from outside, someone checking the handle before pushing it open. All 3 men went still. Roy's hand found the shotgun beneath the counter. Amos shifted his weight, angling himself toward the entrance without seeming to move at all. The door swung open. It was only Nate. 22 years old, hat in his hands, standing awkward in the doorway like a man who'd walked in on something he shouldn't have. His eyes went first to Roy, then to Amos, then hesitant, to the old farmer standing in the corner. "Boss," Nate said. "Careful. Quiet." Dale went to the saloon. Said he wasn't coming back till lunch. A pause. "Figured I'd come see if you needed help minding the counter." Roy exhaled, slow, some of the tension bleeding out of his shoulders now that the danger had turned out to be nothing more than a young man's guilty conscience. "Not right now, Nate. Is everything?" Nate's eyes flicked again toward Walt, lingering a beat too long. "Is everything all right, sir?" Because something in the room felt wrong to him. He couldn't have said what. Just a weight in the air. A stillness that didn't belong in a shop that usually smelled like coffee and gun oil. And the easy chatter of ranch hands buying cartridges. Walt looked at him, really looked at him. This boy who'd laughed at him not 20 minutes ago. 22 years old, uncertain, still learning which parts of himself were worth keeping and which parts he'd absorbed from louder, meaner men because it was easier than figuring out who he wanted to be on his own. "Go on home, son," Walt said. Not unkind, just final. "Come back tomorrow." "But, Nate," Roy's voice gentle but unmistakably closing the conversation. "Go on home." Nate hesitated a moment longer, glancing between the 3 of them, sensing without understanding that he was on the outside of something enormous. Then he nodded slow and stepped back out into the street, the bell ringing softly behind him. The door closed, and the room fell quiet again. Amos exhaled, some tension leaving his shoulders. Good instincts, that boy. Doesn't fully know how to use them yet. He'll learn, Walt said. Or he won't. Either way, it's not our lesson to teach today. Roy checked the clock again, 11:30. 30 minutes. He set the ledger aside entirely now, no longer pretending his hands needed something to do. Walked to the window beside Amos. Looked out at the street, gold with morning light, dust drifting slow and lazy across the packed dirt road. "You never told me," Roy said, without turning. "What happened after? After the 6th one? After you thought it was finished?" Walt's jaw tightened. "I went home," he said. "To the farm." "To the farm and?" Walt was quiet a long moment. The bullets sat in their pouch, half counted, forgotten for now. "And I tried to remember how to be a person again," he said, "instead of a man with a list of names and a map." Roy turned from the window to look at him. Did it work? Something flickered across Walt's face. Not quite an answer. Not quite a lie either. For 14 years, he said. I told myself it did. The words hung there, unfinished, heavier for what they left unsaid. Because the truth Walt had never spoken out loud to another living soul, was this: some nights the farmhouse felt less like a home and more like a museum. A place where he kept Martha's rocking chair by the window exactly where she'd left it, kept her sewing basket on the shelf exactly as she'd arranged it, kept the whole broken shape of his life arranged around an absence he'd never quite learned to stop circling. He had told himself, for 14 years, that the hunting was finished, that the 6 graves scattered across 3 territories had settled the account, that he could go back to being simply a farmer, simply a widower, simply a man who'd survived something terrible and come out the other side changed, but whole enough to keep living. He had told himself that, and for 14 years it had almost been true, until 3 weeks ago, in a dusty street in Cheyenne, a stranger with cold eyes and a familiar surname had proven him wrong, in the space of about 4 seconds and one very precise, very deliberate cut across the side of his face. Walt, Roy's voice, careful, pulling him back. You went somewhere just now. I know. You want to talk about it? No. Roy nodded, accepting it the way old friends learn to accept the doors that stay closed. Amos, still at the window, spoke without turning. 25 minutes. The words dropped into the room, like stones into still water. Walt straightened. Something in his posture shifted, hardened, the tired farmer receding slightly to make room for whatever the last 14 years had turned him into underneath. He closed the leather pouch, tucked it back into his coat, drew the revolver from beneath his duster for the first time since walking in. It was old, well used, the bluing worn thin along the barrel where his hand had rested against it 1,000 times over. Not a showpiece, a tool, an old friend that had outlived every enemy it had ever been pointed at. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. All loaded. Roy watched him do it, and something in his chest ached in a way he didn't have words for. You don't have to do this alone, Roy said. Quiet, insistent. I know that too. Then let us. I said I know it, Roy. Walt's voice softened just slightly, the edge coming off it. Doesn't mean I want it, but I know it. Roy held his gaze a long moment, then nodded, once, and reached beneath the counter, drawing out the shotgun, breaking it open to check the load with hands that were, Walt noticed, steadier than they had any right to be. Amos, at the window, checked his own pistol without a word. The clock ticked toward its final quarter hour, and then, faint but unmistakable, the bell above the door rang once more. All 3 men turned, weapons half raised, breath caught. It wasn't Caleb Vane. It was the deputy. Ward Collins stepped into the shop with the easy, unhurried gait of a man who had walked into 1,000 ordinary rooms on 1,000 ordinary mornings and expected this one to be no different. Middle-aged, thick through the middle in the way of men who spend more time behind a desk than a saddle these days, a tin star pinned crooked to a vest that had seen better decades. His eyes swept the room, took in Roy's shotgun only half lowered, took in Amos's hand still resting near his holster, took in the old farmer standing in the corner with a loaded revolver held loose at his side. Ward's easy expression faltered. Well, he said slowly, this is a friendly gathering, Ward. Roy's voice, carefully neutral, the shotgun disappearing back beneath the counter in one smooth motion. Something we can help you with? Ward's eyes lingered on Walt a beat too long before answering. Just making my morning rounds, he said. Heard there might be some trouble expected round these parts today. He paused. Let the words sit there. Round about noon, if I heard right. The room went very still, because nobody had told the deputy that. Nobody had told anyone that. The 3 men standing in Colby's gun and iron were, as far as any of them knew, the only living souls in Larkspur Hollow aware of exactly what hour death was arriving. Roy's eyes cut sharp toward Walt, toward Amos. Neither man moved. Where Walt said slowly, each word measured, careful. Did you hear a thing like that? Ward's easy smile flickered. Just slightly. Just enough. Around, he said, too casual by half. Folks talk. Folks, Roy repeated. Don't know anything about this. Well, Ward shifted his weight, suddenly less comfortable than he'd been a moment ago. Somebody knew enough to mention it to me. The bell above the door, still faintly swinging from his entrance, seemed to ring one last note into the silence that followed. Because somewhere out there, someone else had known. Someone who wasn't supposed to. Someone who had reason to watch, and reason to talk, and no reason at all that any of the three men in that shop could yet begin to guess at. Walt's grip tightened, almost imperceptibly, around the revolver at his side, and the clock on the wall, indifferent to all of it, ticked steadily on toward noon. Ward cleared his throat, suddenly aware he'd said something he probably shouldn't have, the way men do when the weight of a room shifts faster than they can follow. "Look," he said, holding up a hand, placating. "I don't know the particulars. Just had a fella stop me on the road this morning. Paid me $2 to swing by here around midday. Said there might be trouble worth keeping an eye on." "What fella?" Amos said, flat. Not a question so much as a demand. Didn't catch a name. Ward shifted again, increasingly uneasy under the weight of three sets of eyes that had all gone very sharp, very fast. Stranger. Well-dressed. Rode a gray gelding. If that means anything to anybody. It meant nothing to Walt. Nothing to Roy. Nothing, as far as his face showed, to Amos either. But it meant something. Because a man doesn't pay a deputy $2 to be somewhere at a specific hour, unless that man already knows exactly what's going to happen at that hour. Unless that man has a reason of his own for wanting eyes on this shop when noon arrives. And that meant someone else. Someone none of them had yet accounted for, already knew about Caleb Vane. Already knew about the 14-year debt walking back into town to collect, and had a reason, of their own, for wanting to watch it settled. Walt's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the street outside, still gold and dusty, and deceptively calm. 14 years of hunting men had taught him one lesson above all others. The threat you can see coming is rarely the only one in the room. "Deputy," Walt said slowly, "I'd take it as a kindness if you kept whatever you know to yourself a while longer." Ward frowned, glancing between the three of them, sensing he'd stumbled into something considerably larger than a friendly morning visit. "That an official request," he asked, "or a threat?" "Take it however serves you best," Walt said. "But understand this. Whatever's about to happen in this shop today has nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with a debt that predates you, me, and this whole territory's notion of what justice is supposed to look like." Ward's jaw tightened. For a moment it looked like he might push back, might remember the star pinned to his chest and everything it was supposed to mean. Then his eyes flicked to the clock. 11:45. And something in his posture deflated, just slightly, the way a man's posture deflates when he decides, consciously or not, that today is not the day he wants to test how far his authority actually extends. "I'll be around," he said, backing toward the door. "Case anybody needs the law." "Appreciate it," Roy said, though nothing in his tone suggested he meant it. Ward hesitated at the threshold, glancing back one final time at the old farmer standing in the corner with a loaded revolver and eyes like a winter sky. "Whoever you're waiting on," he said, quieter now, almost reluctant, "I hope you know what you're doing." Walt held his gaze. "So do I," he said. The door closed. The bell rang its small, brittle note into the silence that followed. And through the window, all three men watched Ward Collins cross the street, glancing back over his shoulder twice, before disappearing around the corner toward the sheriff's office. Roy exhaled slowly. "Someone paid him to be here. Someone paid him to watch," Amos corrected. "That's a different thing." "Watch for what?" Neither man had an answer. Walt's grip on the revolver had not loosened, because 14 years ago, when he rode out after the first of the Vane brothers, the world had been simple. A wife dead. A family of killers scattered across the territory. A gun, a horse, and 18 months of relentless, singular purpose. This morning, standing in a shop he hadn't set foot in for over a decade, that simplicity had already begun cracking apart at the edges. Because if a stranger on a gray gelding had paid to have this hour watched, that stranger had known about it before Walt himself had even ridden into town. Had known somehow what Caleb Vane intended, and when and where, which meant Caleb wasn't the only threat riding toward Larkspur Hollow this morning, which meant there was a piece of this story none of them had been told yet. And Walt had learned a long time ago, the hard way, in blood and grief, and 18 months of hunting men through wilderness that didn't care whether he lived or died, that the pieces of a story you don't know about are always the ones that end up costing you the most. 11:48, Amos said quietly, still watching the street. 12 minutes. Roy moved back behind the counter, checked the shotgun one final time. His hands steady now in a way that surprised even him. Amos took up position near the window, angled so he could watch both the street and the door, without exposing himself to either. And Walt stood in the corner, where he'd started this whole long morning, back against the wall, revolver loose at his side, eyes fixed on the empty street beyond the glass, waiting. 14 years of grief had brought him to this exact patch of floor, in this exact shop, on this exact morning. And somewhere out beyond the edge of town, closing the distance, one unhurried mile at a time, a man he had never met but understood better than almost anyone alive was riding toward the appointment they had both, in their own ways, spent their whole lives preparing for. The clock ticked on. The dust hung gold and heavy in the morning light, and Larkspur Hollow, still holding its breath, waited to find out exactly what kind of story it was about to become part of. Because somewhere in the last hour, without any of them fully realizing it yet, the story had already stopped being simple. It had already stopped being just two people and an old debt. Someone else was watching. Someone else had paid to know. And whatever that meant, whatever shape it would eventually take, none of the four men who now understood a stranger's hand was somewhere in the middle of all this, had the slightest idea yet how deep it went, or how far back, or how much blood old and new was tangled up in reasons none of them could see. All they knew, all any of them could know in the 12 minutes left before noon, was this. Something was coming, and it was no longer just the one thing they'd been bracing for. 11 minutes. Roy checked the clock a second time in under a minute, the way a man checks something he already knows the answer to, hoping somehow the answer changed while he wasn't looking. It hadn't. You keep doing that, Amos said quietly. You'll wear a hole clean through the wall. Better the wall than my nerves. Your nerves are already worn through. I can see it in your hands. Roy looked down. His hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough. He set them flat against the counter and pressed down, like he could pin the shaking in place if he just applied enough weight. Walt hadn't moved from the corner in some time. Back against the wall. Revolver loose at his side. Eyes fixed somewhere past the window, past the street, past this particular Tuesday morning entirely. Because his mind had gone somewhere else. It did that sometimes. Had done it for 14 years. Ever since the night, everything, split into two separate lives, the one before and the one after, and his thoughts would slip, without warning, back through that seam, whenever the world went quiet enough to let them. The world was very quiet right now, so his mind slipped. 14 years fell away like a curtain pulled back, and Walt was standing in the dark again, in the cold, in a place his body had never fully left, even though his boots hadn't touched that ground in over a decade. The horses. That was where it always started. The horses first, always the horses, because that was where he'd been when it happened. Not in the tent, not beside her. Checking the picket line, because the coyotes had been bold that week, circling closer each night, and he hadn't wanted to lose another calf. He remembered the exact texture of the rope under his fingers, remembered the smell of horse sweat and cold grass, remembered, with a clarity that still made his stomach drop even now, even here, even 14 years and 100 miles removed from that patch of Montana dirt, the sound. Gunfire first, then Martha's voice, just once. Just his name, torn out of her in a single sharp cry that cut through the dark, and then stopped, all at once, like someone had reached out and snuffed a candle. And then nothing at all. Because there is a particular kind of silence that follows a sound like that. A silence that doesn't feel like absence. It feels like presence. Like the silence itself is a living thing, crouched there in the dark, waiting to see what you'll do next. Walt had done nothing. For 3 full seconds, he had done absolutely nothing. Frozen at the edge of the picket line with a coil of rope still in his hand, And those 3 seconds, those exact 3 seconds, had haunted him more consistently than anything else in the entire 14 years since. Because if he'd moved faster, because if he'd been closer to the tent instead of out with the horses, because if the whole architecture of grief built entirely out of that one useless, endlessly repeating word, he'd run then, finally, legs remembering how to work again. Cut between the wagons, staying low, staying in shadow, some old instinct from a war he barely remembered anymore keeping him alive in those first chaotic seconds. And he'd seen them. 6 riders, torches, laughing, while they rode through a camp of sleeping families and took whatever they wanted and left whatever they didn't behind, burning, broken, silent. He had counted them, made himself count them. Made himself memorize the shape of each rider against the firelight, the color of each horse, the particular way each man sat in his saddle, because some cold, calculating part of him, a part he didn't know existed, until that exact night understood immediately that counting them was the only thing left he could do for Martha. 6 men. He would spend 18 months turning that number into 6 graves. Walt, Roy's voice. Careful, pulling him back the way a hand pulls a man back from the edge of something. Walt blinked. The gun shop resolved around him again, the counter, the rifle case, the dust hanging gold in the light. 11 years old fell back into 14, into the present, into this exact Tuesday. You went somewhere again, Roy said. I know. Bad place? Walt's jaw tightened. There isn't a good one to go to. Not from where my mind starts. Roy didn't push further. He understood, in the particular way that only someone who has watched a friend carry an old wound for years can understand, that some doors are better left shut than forced open before their time. Amos, still at the window, spoke without turning. 10 minutes. The words dropped into the room and settled there, heavier than they should have been for something so small. 10 minutes. A number. Just a number. Except numbers, Walt had learned a long time ago. Stop being just numbers once they start counting down towards something that might kill you. He flexed his fingers around the grip of the revolver. Old habit, checking that his hand still remembered how to close. It did. It always did. That was the terrible, reliable thing about a hand trained by grief. It never forgot how to do what it had been taught to do. Roy moved out from behind the counter, restless, pacing a slow half-circle toward the front window and back again. He stopped near Walt's corner, close enough to talk low. Tell me something, Roy said. Depends what? The 6 of them. The brothers. Roy hesitated, like he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. How'd you find the first one? Walt was quiet a long moment, because some memories come easy, worn smooth by years of handling, and some stay sharp no matter how many times you turn them over. This one had never dulled. Billings, he said finally. Working as a ranch hand under a different name. Thought if he kept his head down long enough, the world would forget what he'd done. Did it? The world forgot, Walt said. I didn't. Roy waited, understood there was more coming, if he was patient enough to let it come at its own pace. I found him mucking out a stable, Walt continued. Middle of the afternoon. Told him my name. Watched him understand all at once, exactly what that meant. A pause. Gave him the chance to draw first. Man deserves that much, even a man like him. And he was fast, Walt said. I was faster. The words came out flat. No pride in them, no satisfaction. Just fact. Delivered the way a man delivers weather, something that happened. Something true. Something he had learned not to feel anything at all about anymore, because feeling anything about it would have made the next 5 impossible to survive. Roy's throat worked. The second one ran. Walt said. Smart thing to do, if you're going to do anything. Didn't save him. Tracked him 3 days through rough country. Found him trying to cross a river at night, thinking the dark would cover him. Walt's eyes went distant again, briefly. River took him before I had to. You didn't? No, Walt said. I watched. Couldn't have stopped it if I'd wanted to. Current had him, before I got within 100 yards. Roy exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath since the question left his mouth. Third and fourth were brothers to each other too. Walt went on, quieter now, the words coming easier once they'd started. The way old wounds sometimes loosen once you finally let them speak. Barricaded themselves in a line shack. Thought they could wait me out. How long did that take? 5 days. Burned them out on the 6th. Amos, still at the window, hadn't turned around, but something in the set of his shoulders had gone very still, listening. 5th one was smart, Walt said. Changed his name. Grew a beard. Took work at a mining camp in Idaho, quiet as a church mouse. His jaw tightened. But he wrote his mother. Once a month, regular as Sunday. I was watching her house. Roy didn't ask what happened next. Didn't need to. 6th was the leader, Walt said. The one who'd planned the whole thing. The one whose voice caught, just slightly, just enough that Roy heard it. The one whose torch I saw closest to the tent that night. The room went very still. I found him in a saloon in Cheyenne, Walt said. Comfortable. Careless. Thought enough time had passed that nobody was still counting. His hand tightened once more around the revolver. Challenged him in front of 30 witnesses. Fair fight. Old West rules. He drew first, and I drew faster. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it in that shop. Heavier, older, like it carried the actual weight of 6 deaths inside it, settling down over the dusty floorboards and the rifle cases and the 3 men standing among them. Amos finally turned from the window. 18 months, he said. 6 men. 3 territories. That's the story people tell, Walt said. It's mostly right. Mostly. Walt's eyes flicked to him. Something guarded moving behind them. Nobody tells the part where I stopped sleeping, he said. Nobody tells the part where I'd wake up some nights not remembering which year it was, or whether Martha was already gone or still sleeping beside me. Nobody tells the part where finishing it didn't feel like finishing anything at all. Just felt like running out of names. Roy's face had gone pale, listening. Did it help? He asked, echoing a question he'd apparently been carrying since long before this morning. Any of it. Did any part of it help? Walt considered the question a long time before answering. For about a week, he said, after the 6th one. I thought it had. Thought the weight might finally lift. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the gold light outside, toward the empty street that would not stay empty much longer. Then I went home. To the farm. Walked into that house, and Martha's chair was still sitting right where she'd left it, and I understood, all at once, standing there in the doorway, that killing 6 men hadn't brought back one single thing that mattered. Then why do it? Roy asked. Quiet. If it didn't help. Because the alternative, Walt said, was letting them live free while she stayed dead. And some things a man can't let stand. Even knowing it won't fix anything. Even knowing the weight just moves. Doesn't disappear. Just moves from one shoulder to the other. Nobody spoke for a while after that. The clock ticked on. Amos checked the street again. 8 minutes. Roy's hand drifted, unconsciously toward his own chest, like he could feel something there that had nothing to do with his heartbeat. Walt, he said, there's something you should know. About that debt I keep telling you doesn't exist. Walt's eyes came back into focus, settling on his old friend. Roy, just let me say it, Roy said. Please, before whatever's about to happen happens. Walt nodded once. Roy's gaze drifted, unfocused, toward the window, toward a horizon that wasn't there, toward a winter 14 years gone that had never fully left him either. 1901 wasn't the first time I nearly died, Roy said. It wasn't even the worst. Just the one that mattered most. Because it's the one where I met you. Because sometimes a man has to go backward before he can go forward. Has to walk himself back through the cold and the dark and the particular kind of fear that comes from watching wagons sink slowly into snow that doesn't care whether you live to see morning. Roy closed his eyes and let himself go there. The pass had no name that any of the wagon crew ever learned. Just elevation and weather and 12 wagons strung out along a trail that had stopped being a trail an hour before, buried under snow that kept coming and showed no sign of stopping. Roy had been a lieutenant then. Army Corps of Engineers, though the title had felt like a joke by the time the storm hit, because nothing he'd learned in any classroom had prepared him for watching horses go down one by one in cold that turned breath to ice before it left a man's mouth. The first wagon lost a wheel around dusk. The second wedged itself between two boulders an hour later, and by the time full dark came down, the whole convoy had stopped moving. 12 wagons and 50 men frozen in place on a mountainside that seemed determined to bury every last one of them before morning. His commanding officer had shouted himself hoarse, trying to force a solution through sheer volume. Push harder. Try again. Get the horses moving. And the horses had kept dying instead. Roy remembered the exact moment he'd stopped believing they would survive the night. Remembered standing beside a horse that had gone down in the traces, steam rising off its flanks in the freezing air, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that he was probably going to die on this mountain 26 years old, 1,000 miles from anywhere that mattered to him. And then, out of the white, out of a wind so thick it swallowed, sound whole a rider had appeared. No warning, no hail, just a shape resolving slowly out of the storm, moving with a calm that seemed almost impossible given the chaos surrounding it. A woman on a horse would have made more sense to him back then if a woman had ridden up out of a blizzard on a mountain pass in the middle of nowhere. Instead, it was a man, younger than Roy expected, given everything he'd later learn about the reputation attached to the name. Dressed plain. Moving like the cold meant nothing to him, like the storm was simply weather and not the death sentence everyone else in that convoy had already resigned themselves to. He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't asked permission, just walked the length of the stranded wagons, checking angles, weight, the position of every failing horse, while Roy's commanding officer shouted at him to clear off. This was army business. They didn't need help from some drifter who'd wandered up out of a snowstorm uninvited. The man had ignored him entirely, started giving instructions instead. Not to the officers, to the men. Told them where to reposition the horses, where to place leverage, how to redistribute weight across axles that were about to snap under the strain of ice and gradient and desperation. I thought he was mad, Roy said now, eyes still closed, voice thick with the memory. This lone man, in a blizzard, telling trained engineers we didn't know how to move our own wagons. But you listened, Walt said quietly. I listened, Roy agreed, because I'd been staring at a dying horse for the better part of 10 minutes, trying to work out how many of us were going to freeze before morning. And something about the way he moved like the storm didn't frighten him at all, made me want to believe he knew something the rest of us didn't. It took 6 hours. 6 hours of hauling, repositioning, easing wagons free one impossible inch at a time, following instructions from a stranger whose name none of them yet knew, while the temperature dropped another 20 degrees and the wind screamed loud enough to swallow every shouted command. But by the time the sky began to gray towards something resembling dawn, every wagon was moving again. Every man was still breathing. 50 lives. 50 lives, saved by a stranger who never gave his name, who rode off into the thinning storm before anyone thought to properly thank him, leaving behind nothing but frozen wagon ruts and a story that would take Roy 3 more years to fully understand. I didn't know who you were, Roy said, opening his eyes now, looking directly at Walt. Not that night. Not for years after. When did you find out? 3 years later. Mustered out. Came back here to run my father's shop. Roy's voice thickened. A woman walked in one day asking about a custom Colt. Specific grip, specific barrel length, and something about the way she carried herself. He stopped. Walt's expression had shifted, some old grief moving behind his eyes. That was Martha, Walt said quietly, buying that gun, before I even knew what she'd need it for. Roy nodded slowly. I didn't put it together right then. Not fully. But months later, when the stories started reaching this far east, the widower hunting 6 men through 3 territories, I asked around. Learned your name. Learned you'd been out west, that winter, that particular pass. His voice cracked just slightly, and I understood, all at once, that the man who'd saved 50 lives in a snowstorm, asking nothing in return, not even his name, was the same man now spending every waking hour hunting down the family that had taken his wife. Walt said nothing for a long moment. You never told me you knew, he finally said. You never wanted to talk about it, Roy said. I respected that. Figured the debt didn't need saying out loud to still be real. There is no debt, Roy. There's always a debt, Roy said, voice firmer now than Walt had heard it all morning. You just don't like being the one people owe it to. Walt held his gaze a long moment, then looked away, out toward the window, toward the street, toward the ticking clock and the gold dust and the 6 minutes that remained before whatever was coming came. Because some debts, he had learned a long time ago, don't get paid in money or in words. They get paid in showing up, in standing beside someone when the easier thing, the safer thing, would be walking away. Roy had shown up today. That would have to be enough. Amos's voice cut through the quiet. Riders. Both men turned sharply. Plural, Roy asked, already moving toward the counter toward the shotgun. Can't tell yet, Amos said, squinting through the glass. Dust's kicked up too far out. Walt straightened off the wall, revolver rising slightly, every old instinct snapping back into place at once. Because 6 minutes had suddenly become an uncertain number. Because riders, plural, had never once been part of the arrangement Caleb Vane had promised in Cheyenne. The dust on the horizon thickened, closer now, and through it slowly, a shape began to resolve. One horse, one rider, but moving fast. Faster than the unhurried pace Walt had expected. Fast enough that Amos's hand drifted instinctively toward his holster. That's not him, Amos said slowly. Way he described. This one's riding like something's chasing them. The rider came into clearer focus as the distance closed. Slight frame, dark coat whipping in the wind of their own speed. Hat gone, lost somewhere on the road behind them, dark hair streaming loose, a woman. She pulled her horse up hard outside the shop, dismounting almost before the animal had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground at a stumbling run that carried her straight for the door. The bell rang, violent, as she shoved it open. Is he here yet? Her voice came out ragged, desperate, eyes sweeping the shop wildly. Tell me he isn't here yet. Roy's shotgun had come up halfway. Before he registered, she was unarmed, panic-stricken, clearly not the threat any of them had braced for. Who are you? Walt said, voice low, careful, revolver still steady in his hand. The woman's eyes found him, held, and something in her face broke, relief and terror, tangled together in equal measure. My name is Nora, she said, breathless. Nora Vane. A pause, her chest heaving. I'm the one who's going to marry Caleb. If he lives long enough for either of us to get the chance. The name landed in the shop like a struck match. Roy's grip tightened on the shotgun. Amos's hand hovered, uncertain, near his holster. And Walt simply stared at her. Something cold and calculating, moving behind his eyes as 14 years of hard-earned instinct, assessed her, weighed her, tried to determine in the space of a single breath whether she was truth or trap. You're his, Walt said slowly. And you rode here. I rode here, Nora said, because if I don't say this before noon, he's going to walk into this shop and die for a reason that isn't even his. Explain, Amos said. Flat. No patience left for riddles. Nora pressed a hand to her chest, still catching her breath, eyes darting between the three men like she was trying to decide who among them would actually listen. There's a man, she said. Corbin Lash. Works for the Ashford family. You know that name? Roy's face went carefully blank. Cattle outfit. Big land holdings north of here. Bigger than you think, Nora said. And they've been trying to buy your farm for 3 years, Mr. Colby. Every offer refused. Every letter ignored. Her eyes fixed on Walt. You didn't know that, did you? Walt's jaw tightened. I don't sell to men I've never met. That's the problem, Nora said. Because your land sits between 2 water sources, the Ashfords need to expand their grazing routes. And they've decided the easiest way to get it. Her voice caught. The easiest way to finally get it is if there's no one left alive to say no. The room went very still. Say that again, Roy said, slow, dangerous. They found Caleb 2 years ago, Nora said. Knew who he was before he knew it himself, really. Knew about his brothers. Knew about, she glanced at Walt, apologetic, about you. And they've spent 2 years feeding him just enough truth to keep his grief burning, while quietly making sure that whatever happens today, whichever one of you walks away, there's a piece of paper already drawn up transferring the Colby land to the Ashford name. Contingent on the current owner's death. Walt's blood went cold. That's not possible, he said. I have no living kin. No will drafted naming. You don't need a will, Nora said, if there's no one left to contest the claim. Unclaimed land reverts to the territory. And the territory has been very, very friendly to Ashford money for a long time now. Amos swore under his breath, low, the kind of profanity that came from a man who'd seen enough corruption in his life to recognize its shape from a mile off. And if Caleb kills me, Walt said slowly, working it through, and someone else kills Caleb, and there's no vein left to ever come asking questions, Nora finished. No witness, no complication. Just an old feud that finally burned itself out exactly the way everyone always expected it would. Who kills Caleb? Roy asked after. Nora's eyes went to the window, to the street, to something out there that had clearly been chasing her the whole desperate ride into town. Corbin Lash, she said. He's not far behind me. Maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Amos repeated. After the appointment Caleb already promised for noon. Which means, Walt said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, cold and precise, whatever happens between me and Caleb in this shop was never meant to be the end of it, Nora said. It was meant to be the beginning of something much worse. Something that erases every trace of either of you, cleanly, quietly, and leaves nothing behind but an empty farm and a legal document already signed. The clock above the register ticked toward the 4-minute mark, indifferent, relentless. Does Caleb know? Roy asked. About any of this? Nora's face crumpled just slightly. Grief and love tangled together in a way that made her look, for one unguarded moment, much younger than she was. He knows some of it, she said. Enough to be angry about it. Not enough to see how badly he's being used. Her voice dropped. He thinks this is still just about his brothers. About honor. About finishing something that was started before either of us was born. She looked at Walt, pleading now. He doesn't know that whoever wins in this room today, Ashford wins more. He doesn't know that his death was already decided, before he even left home this morning. Walt's hand tightened around the revolver, because 14 years of grief had taught him plenty about what it meant to be consumed by a story someone else had written for him. And it was a bitter, familiar kind of horror to learn that the man riding toward him with murder in his heart had all along simply been another piece moved across somebody else's board. Amos, Walt said, voice tight, controlled. Go find the deputy. Amos's eyes narrowed. Ward? He knew about noon before any of us told him, Walt said. Said a stranger paid him $2 to watch this shop. Gray gelding. His eyes flicked to Nora. That sound like anyone you know? Nora's face went pale. Corbin rides Gray. Always has. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees all at once. So the deputy, Roy said slowly, working it through, was paid by Ashford's man to watch this exact shop at this exact hour. Which means, Amos said, already moving toward the door, Ward Collins isn't just careless. He's compromised. And I intend to find out how deep. Amos, Walt started. 3 minutes, Amos said, cutting him off, already pulling the door open. I'll be quick. And careful. I've done this dance before, son. Long before you were old enough to grow that scar. He was gone before Walt could argue further, the bell ringing sharp behind him, boots striking fast against the boardwalk outside. Roy turned to Nora, shotgun still cradled but no longer raised. Why come here? Why not just go to Caleb? Stop him yourself before he ever reaches town. I tried, Nora said, voice breaking for the first time. Followed him 3 days. He wouldn't listen. Said this was the only thing he had left that was his. Said, if he walked away now, everything he'd sacrificed Mary, the 2 years he'd spent training, all of it would mean nothing. Mary, Walt repeated, quiet. His fiancée. Before me. Nora's eyes dropped. She left him 18 months ago. Said he'd chosen dead men over a living one. She wasn't wrong. Walt's chest ached sudden and sharp, in a way that had nothing to do with age. Because he recognized that particular grief, the specific hollow shape of a man who has let the dead take up so much room inside him. There's no longer space left for anyone living. He had lived inside that same shape for 14 years. He's not just coming to kill me, Walt said slowly, understanding arriving in full now, cold and total. He's coming because it's the only thing left that still feels like it means something. Nora nodded, tears finally breaking free, running silent down her face. "That's why I need you to understand," she said. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, please don't let him die, thinking his life was only ever worth the weight of his brother's names. He's more than that. He has to be more than that, or none of the last 2 years meant anything at all." The clock struck noon. Nobody moved, because there had been an appointment precise and absolute, a single hour named and agreed to across the distance of 3 weeks, and one long, blood-soaked scar, and now that hour had arrived, and the street outside remained maddeningly, terrifyingly empty. "He's late," Roy said, voice tight. "He's never late," Nora said. "Not once in 2 years of watching him plan this. Something's wrong." Walt's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Corbin Lash intercepting him early, an accident on the road, a change of plan that none of them had been told about. Or worse, somehow, though he couldn't say exactly why it felt worse. Caleb simply standing somewhere just out of sight, working up the nerve to walk through a door he had spent 2 years imagining himself walking through with absolute certainty. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The shop, so tightly wound only moments before, now sat suspended in a strange, unbearable limbo, the appointed hour come and gone. The promised confrontation nowhere in sight, every certainty they'd built the morning around suddenly terribly uncertain. "Should we go look for him?" Roy asked low. "No," Walt said. "If Ashford's man is already circling, moving now could put us right in his path instead of Caleb's." "So we wait," Roy said. "So we wait," Walt agreed, "and hope Amos finds something worth finding before whatever's coming comes." Nora sank onto a low stool near the counter, exhausted, wrung out from the ride, from the fear, from carrying a secret 2 years in the making that had finally, at the worst possible moment, come apart in her hands. "I should have told him," she said quietly, more to herself than to either man. "Should have told him the truth the moment I learned it, instead of waiting, hoping he'd figure it out himself before it was too late." "Why didn't you?" Walt asked. Not unkind, just honest. Nora looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed, exhausted. "Because I was afraid," she said, "that if I told him the truth, that his revenge had been engineered, manipulated, used, he'd feel like even his grief wasn't fully his own anymore. Like there was nothing left that belonged to him at all." Her voice cracked. "And I was afraid that kind of emptiness might be worse than anything Ashford could ever do to him, directly." Walt understood that fear better than he wished he did, because he had spent 14 years terrified of a similar emptiness. The fear that if he ever let go of the hunt, ever set down the weight of it, there would be nothing left inside him worth calling a life. He had been wrong, in the end. Or at least he'd told himself he was wrong. On the good days, the rare mornings, when the farmhouse felt like a home again, instead of a museum. But some part of him, some old and stubborn part, had never fully stopped wondering if setting the weight down really would leave him hollow. Maybe that was what Caleb was riding toward right now, somewhere out beyond the edge of town. The same terrible question, from the opposite direction. The bell above the door rang, sharp, urgent. Amos, breathing hard, face grim in a way that made every muscle in Walt's body tense at once. "Found him," Amos said. "Ward?" Roy asked, behind the livery. Meeting a man matching Nora's description of Lash right down to the gray gelding. Amos's jaw was tight, furious. "Heard enough before they spotted me to know exactly how deep this goes." "Tell us," Walt said. Amos glanced at Nora, hesitated briefly, then decided the time for careful delivery had long since passed. "Lash isn't just watching," Amos said. "He's got orders. Whoever walks out of this confrontation, Colby or Vane, dies before sundown." Ward's job was simple. Keep the law looking the other way while it happens. $2 for silence this morning. Considerably more promised for silence tonight. Roy's hands had gone white-knuckled around the shotgun. "And if neither of us walks out," Walt said slowly, "if Caleb and I kill each other before Lash even needs to lift a finger, then Ashford gets everything they wanted," Amos finished. Grim, without ever having to dirty their own hands at all. The shop fell into a heavy, furious silence. Nora had gone very still on her stool, hands pressed hard against her mouth, eyes wide with a horror that went beyond fear now into something closer to grief. Because whatever happened in the next hour, however it unfolded, whoever walked away, the truth had finally arrived, undeniable and complete. None of it, not one single piece of the last 14 years, not the 6 graves scattered across 3 territories, not the scar carved into Walt's face in a Cheyenne street, not the 2 years Caleb had spent training himself into a weapon aimed at a woman he'd never even met until 3 weeks ago. None of it had ever truly been about grief or honor or the particular arithmetic of blood owed for blood taken. It had been about land. It had been about water rights and grazing routes and a family with more money than conscience deciding, somewhere in a comfortable office, far from any of this dust and danger, that the cleanest way to acquire what they wanted was to let 2 grieving strangers destroy each other and simply collect what was left behind. "We have to find him," Walt said, voice hard now, decision settling into him like iron. "Before Lash does." Walt Roy started. "He's not my enemy anymore," Walt said, cutting him off, the words arriving with a clarity that surprised even himself. "He never should have been, not really. Not once you strip away everything Ashford built on top of it." He turned to Nora. "Where would he go?" Walt asked. "If he found the shop empty at noon? If something delayed him and he arrived to find the appointment already passed?" Nora thought fast, wiping tears roughly from her face, forcing her mind back into focus. "He'd think he'd missed it," she said. "Think you'd left. Or worse, think you'd never intended to show at all. That the whole thing had been some kind of trick." Her eyes widened suddenly. "He'd go to the ridge, east of town, where he's been camped the last 3 days, watching the road." "Distance?" Amos asked, already moving toward the door. 20 minutes on horseback. Maybe less if you push." Roy was already grabbing his hat, checking the shotgun one final time. His earlier fear transformed now into something closer to fierce, protective urgency. "Then we ride," he said. "All of us." Walt hesitated only a moment, revolver still steady in his grip, the weight of 14 years pressing down on him one final time, before he made the choice that would define whatever remained of this long, terrible morning. Because this had started as a story about revenge, about an old debt finally coming due, about 2 people shaped by the same tragedy from opposite directions, meant to collide in a single violent moment inside a dusty gun shop at noon. But somewhere in the last hour, without any of them fully choosing it, the story had become something else entirely. Not 2 enemies, circling toward a reckoning. 4 people, 5, counting the man they hadn't even met yet, all of them caught in the gears of something larger, colder, and infinitely more calculated than any grief either Walt or Caleb had carried alone. "Amos," Walt said. "Ward." "Where is he now, Ran?" Amos said grimly. "The moment he realized I'd heard enough. Wouldn't stay to explain himself." "Then he'll warn Lash," Roy said. "That we know." "Maybe," Amos said. "Or maybe he'll run far enough and fast enough that guilt catches up with him before greed does. Man like that, I've seen it go either way." Walt moved toward the door, revolver holstered now, replaced by something steadier, more purposeful than the raw grief he'd carried into this shop hours earlier. "Then we don't wait to find out which," he said. "We ride now. Before Lash decides waiting isn't worth the risk anymore." Nora rose from the stool, unsteady but resolute. "I'm coming too," she said. "It's dangerous," Roy said. "He's the man I intend to marry," Nora said, voice hardening. "I didn't ride 3 days and outrun a hired gun just to sit safely behind a counter while the rest of you decide his fate for him." Walt looked at her a long moment, saw in her face an echo of something he recognized intimately, the particular fierce stubbornness of someone determined to save what they loved, whatever the cost, whatever the danger. He had worn that same expression once, 18 months into a hunt that everyone told him was hopeless. "All right," he said. "Then we ride together." The 4 of them moved out into the gold afternoon light, the bell above the door ringing one final time behind them, urgent, unanswered. Outside, the town of Larkspur Hollow carried on in blissful ignorance. Wagons rattling past, children laughing somewhere down the boardwalk, a woman calling a greeting to a neighbor she hadn't seen since Sunday. None of them knew yet what was unfolding at the edge of their quiet little world. None of them knew that an old debt 14 years in the making had just become something far larger, far more dangerous. tangled up with land and money, and the quiet, patient greed of men who'd never once had to look their victims in the eye. Walt swung up onto his horse, the animal shifting beneath him, sensing the urgency in its rider's hands. He looked east toward the ridge, toward wherever Caleb Vane was waiting, still believing, as far as any of them knew, that this story had only ever been about 6 graves and one scarred, grieving farmer finally come to answer for them. 20 minutes, Nora said, swinging up onto her own horse beside him, voice tight with fear and determination in equal measure. Maybe less. Then we don't waste any of it, Walt said. And with that, the 4 of them rode out of Larkspur Hollow together, dust rising gold behind them, racing against a threat none of them had known existed that morning, toward a reckoning that had just become far larger and far more dangerous than any single grief could ever fully explain. Because somewhere out on that ridge, a man who had spent 2 years training himself to kill stray stranger was about to discover that the only people trying to save his life were the very people he'd ridden 3 weeks to destroy. And somewhere behind them, closing distance with the same unhurried, terrible patience that had once defined Walt's own 18-month hunt so long ago, a hired killer named Corbin Lash rode toward the same ridge, carrying orders that made no distinction at all between enemies and innocents. Only results, only silence, only a signed piece of paper, waiting patiently in a comfortable office far away, for news that both names on an old bitter feud had finally, permanently, gone quiet. The clock in Roy Whitfield's empty shop kept ticking, indifferent, marking a noon appointment that had come and gone without blood, without resolution, without either death anyone had spent the morning bracing for. But somewhere out on that dusty eastern ridge, a new and far more dangerous clock had already begun its own countdown, and none of the riders racing toward it yet knew exactly how little time remained before it, too, ran out. The ridge came into view as the sun tilted past its highest point, throwing long gold light across the scrub pine and broken rock that marked the eastern edge of Larkspur Hollow's reach. 4 horses, 4 riders, dust rising behind them like smoke off a fire. Nobody had lit yet. Walt rode in front, jaw set, eyes scanning the terrain the way they'd scanned terrain for 18 months, 14 years ago, back when reading a landscape correctly meant the difference between finding a man and losing him forever. Because old skills don't fade. They just wait. They wait in the hands, in the eyes. In the particular way, a man's shoulders square themselves when the ground ahead might be hiding something that wants to kill him. Roy rode beside him, shotgun cradled across his lap, face grim in a way Walt had never seen on him before. Not even 14 years ago, standing in a blizzard, watching horses die one by one in the traces. This was different. This was personal now, and personal changes a man's face in ways nothing else quite manages. Amos rode a length behind, eyes constantly moving, sweeping the tree line, the rocks, the shadows pooling dark beneath the pines. 68 years old and still reading a landscape, better than most men half his age. And Nora rode hardest of all of them, leaning low over her horse's neck, dark hair streaming behind her, face carved out of pure, terrified determination. Because somewhere ahead of them, on this exact ridge, the man she loved was sitting alone, believing himself abandoned, believing the appointment he'd spent 2 years building toward had simply evaporated, unanswered, meaningless. And somewhere behind them, closer now, always closer, a hired killer rode with no interest at all in anyone's grief, only in results. They crested the first rise, and Nora's hand shot up, sharp, urgent. There Walt followed her gaze. A man stood near a rock outcropping a quarter-mile ahead, horse tethered loosely nearby, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. Still, waiting. The exact posture of someone who has been waiting so long that waiting has become its own kind of exhaustion. Caleb Vane. Walt's chest tightened, because this was the moment. 14 years distilled down into 1/4 mile of open ground between an old farmer and a young man who'd spent 2 years training himself to end that farmer's life. Except now the whole shape of the story had changed. Now it wasn't a reckoning at all. Now it was a rescue, dressed up in the same terrible clothes a reckoning would have worn. "Let me go first," Nora said, already pulling ahead. "He won't shoot at me." "He won't," she said again, harder this time. "Shoot at me." Walt let her go, because some things a man learns not to argue with. The certainty in a woman's voice, when she's talking about the one thing in this world she understands better than anyone else standing near her. Nora's horse ate up the distance fast, hooves throwing dust into the gold afternoon light, and Caleb's head snapped up at the sound, hand dropping instinctively toward his holster before recognition stopped him cold. "Nora!" His voice carried across the distance, confused, sharp with something between relief and fury. "What are you doing here?" "I told you to stay away from." "Shut up and listen," Nora said, pulling her horse up hard beside him, breathless, because we don't have much time, and everything you think you know about today is wrong. Caleb's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked past her, to the 3 riders approaching behind, and something in his face hardened all over again. "He brought friends," Caleb said, voice flat bitter. "Figured as much. 14 years hunting my brothers alone, and now he needs an audience to finish the—" "He didn't bring friends to fight you," Nora cut in. "He brought them because someone else is trying to kill both of you." That stopped him. Caleb's eyes narrowed, confusion cracking through the anger for just a moment. "What?" Because that single word what carried more weight than any sentence could have. Carried 2 years of certainty starting to buckle, right there, in the space of 1 syllable. Walt reined up a careful distance away, close enough to speak, far enough to leave room for whatever came next. He studied the man he'd spent 3 weeks preparing to meet. Younger than he'd imagined, somehow, despite everything he'd been told. Lean, tired around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. A man who had clearly spent 2 years building himself into a weapon, and looked up close like the weapon had cost him more than he'd ever admit. "Colby," Caleb said, voice tight. "Vane," Walt answered. Neither man reached for a gun. Neither man moved at all. For a long suspended moment, 2 strangers shaped by the same tragedy from opposite directions, finally standing close enough to see exactly what that tragedy had made of the other. "You're late," Caleb said finally. "I waited. Noon came. Noon went." Thought, his voice caught, betraying something underneath the anger. "Thought maybe you'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble after all." "I was there," Walt said, "waiting same as you. Something else got in the way." "What?" Walt's eyes flicked to Nora, then back. "You know a man named Corbin Lash?" Something shifted behind Caleb's eyes. Recognition, fast and unwelcome. "He works for the people funding this," Caleb said slowly. "Ashford family. Been covering my expenses 2 years now. Training, travel. Said it was in the family's interest. Seeing justice finally done for what your gun did to the Vane name." "And you believed that?" Walt said. "Not unkind. Just direct." Caleb's jaw worked. "Why wouldn't I? Man loses 6 brothers he never even got to meet. Somebody offers to help him understand why. Help him find the man responsible. What reason would I have to question the help?" "Because the help," Nora said, voice breaking in, "was never about your brothers, at all." Caleb turned to her, something desperate flashing across his face. "Nora, they want the land," she said. "Walt's land. Been trying to buy it 3 years and he wouldn't sell. So they found a cleaner way to get it. Found you. Fed you just enough truth about your family to keep the grief burning. All so that, whatever happened today, win or lose, there'd be nobody left standing to say no to the deed, already sitting drawn up in some office, waiting for both your names to go quiet." The words landed slow, each one a separate blow. Caleb stood very still, processing, his whole face working through something too large to hold at once. "That's not—" he started at, stopped, started again. "That's not possible. Corbin's been nothing but honest with me. Told me everything, about my brothers, about the raid, about everything except the part where he's the one meant to kill you," Walt said. "Final. The moment I'm already dead." Caleb's face went white. Because there is a particular kind of horror that arrives not from discovering a lie, but from discovering that the lie had been built with such patient, careful precision that it never once felt like anything but truth. "No," Caleb said, weak, unconvincing even to himself. "No, that's—" He's 20 minutes behind us, Amos said, riding up now, voice grim. Maybe less. Caleb's hand drifted to his holster, instinct overriding the shock, some old training taking over where thought had temporarily failed him. Then let him come, Caleb said, voice hardening. I've trained 2 years. I can. You can what? Walt said, sharp enough to cut through the panic. Die proving a point nobody but Ashford's ledger will ever remember. Because that's exactly what he wants, son. Wants both of us reaching for guns instead of thinking straight. Wants the confusion. Wants the blood already spilled before he even has to lift a finger himself. Caleb's jaw tightened, chest heaving. So what, he said, we just what? Stand here. Wait for him to arrive and take his shot? No, Walt said. We get ahead of it. How? Walt's eyes swept the ridge, calculating fast, old instincts from a different war, a different hunt, snapping back into focus with terrible clarity. Rocks to the east, he said. High ground. Enough cover for 4, maybe 5 people if we're tight about it. He looked at Roy. You still remember how to hold a line. Roy's grip tightened on the shotgun. Never forgot, he said. Walt turned back to Caleb. You want to prove your 2 years of training were worth something, he said. Prove it by staying alive long enough to see the man who used you finally answer for it. Caleb hesitated. 2 years of purpose, of singular focus, of a grief carefully sharpened into a weapon aimed at exactly one target, suddenly had nowhere left to point. You're asking me to trust you, Caleb said slowly. The man I came here to kill. I'm asking you, Walt said, to trust that the truth matters more than the story somebody else wrote for both of us. A pause. I spent 14 years hunting your family because of what happened to mine. And in all that time, I never once stopped to ask who might be standing behind the whole thing, pulling threads none of us could see. His eyes hardened. I'm asking now. Late. But I'm asking. Silence stretched between them, taut, uncertain. Then Caleb's shoulders dropped, just slightly. Not surrender. Something closer to exhaustion, finally allowed to show itself after 2 years of holding everything rigid and controlled. All right, he said. Quiet. Final. The rocks. They moved fast, the 5 of them. Horses left tethered in a shallow draw where the terrain offered some cover. Boots scrambling up loose scree toward the outcropping Walt had marked. Because minutes mattered now. Because somewhere behind them, closing distance with the same terrible patience, Walt himself had once used to hunt 6 men across 3 territories. Corbin Lash rode toward a job he expected to be simple. 2 grieving strangers, already exhausted by their own reckoning, easy enough to finish off once the real fight had worn them down. He had no idea, yet, that the fight had already changed shape entirely. Walt reached the high ground first, dropping into position behind a jagged shelf of rock, revolver drawn, eyes fixed on the trail below. Roy settled in beside him, shotgun steady now, despite the earlier tremor in his hands. How do you want to play it? Roy asked. Quiet, Walt said. Let him think he's still got the advantage. Let him get close enough that closeness stops being his friend. Amos took position on the opposite flank, pistol drawn, old scouting instincts guiding him into a spot with clear sight lines and minimal exposure. Caleb crouched near the center, Nora beside him, both of them watching the trail with the particular tension of people who have just discovered the ground beneath their entire understanding of the world has shifted. Walt, Caleb said. Low. What? If this goes wrong, Caleb said, if Lash gets the drop on us before we're ready. It won't, Walt said. You don't know that. No, Walt admitted. I don't. But I've learned something these last 14 years. Certainty's a luxury. Preparation's the only thing that's ever actually mattered. Caleb was quiet a moment, absorbing that. My brothers, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Did any of them, when you found them, did any of them say anything? About me. About whether they even knew I existed. Walt's chest tightened, because this was not a question he had expected. Not here, not now, crouched behind rock with a killer riding closer by the minute. But it was, he understood suddenly, exactly the question a man in Caleb's position had probably been carrying for 2 full years, buried beneath the training and the purpose and the careful architecture of revenge Ashford had built around him. No, Walt said honestly. Not one of them mentioned a brother apart from each other. I don't think they knew. Something in Caleb's face fell, just slightly. Relief and grief tangled together in a way that made no sense and made perfect sense all at once. So I've spent 2 years, Caleb said, voice thick, avenging 6 men who never even knew I was alive to avenge. Seems that way, Walt said, gentle for the first time. Doesn't make the grief less real. Just makes it lonelier. Caleb finished. Walt nodded once. He understood that particular loneliness better than he wished he did. There, Amos said sharp, cutting through the moment. Movement. East Trail. All eyes snapped toward the ridge below. A single rider emerged from the tree line, moving at a careful, measured pace, gray gelding picking its way over broken ground with the ease of a horse used to difficult terrain. Corbin Lash. Even from this distance, something about the way he sat his saddle radiated a cold, professional calm. No hurry, no hesitation. A man who had done this exact kind of work enough times that it no longer registered as anything more than a task to complete. He drew rein near the shop's tethered horses in the draw below, studying the ground for a long moment, reading tracks the way a hunter reads tracks. Walt's stomach tightened, because Lash was good. Good enough to notice 5 sets of tracks, where he'd expected to find, at most 2. The killer's head lifted slowly, scanning the ridge above with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has survived a great many ambushes by never once assuming the ground ahead was empty just because it looked that way. He knows, Roy whispered. Maybe, Walt murmured back. Or maybe he's just careful. Either way, Colby, the voice carried up from below, calm, almost conversational. I know you're up there. Been doing this kind of work a long time. You get a feel for when the ground's lying to you. Nobody moved. Nobody answered. I'm not here for complicated, Lash called out. Just here to finish a job. Whichever one of you's still breathing when I ride up, that's the one who dies first. Simple as that. Rest of you can walk away, if you're smart enough to stay out of it. That's a lie, Nora hissed, low, furious. He won't let any witnesses walk. Not with what we know now. Walt's jaw tightened. She was right. He could hear it, underneath the false generosity of Lash's offer, the practiced ease of a man who had made similar false promises before, to people who hadn't survived long enough to regret believing them. Mr. Lash, Walt called down, voice carrying flat and even across the open ground. You work for the Ashfords. A pause below. Then, almost amused, I work for whoever pays on time. They're using you, Walt said, same as they used him. He nodded toward Caleb, though Lash couldn't see the gesture. Once we're both dead, you think they keep you around? Or do they decide a man who knows this much is a liability worth cleaning up too? Silence, longer this time. Because Walt had learned, across 18 months of hunting 6 brothers through 3 territories, that even the coldest men carry a particular kind of vanity. The belief that they are irreplaceable. The belief that they, unlike everyone else caught in the machine, will somehow be the exception. It was sometimes the only crack a man like that ever showed. Careful, Lash called back, voice tightening just slightly, telling a professional how to read his own employer. I'm not telling you anything, Walt said. Just asking you to consider the math. Same math you've probably already run 100 times, on 100 other jobs, for men who thought they were different. Another pause, then sharp, decisive enough talking. Lash's horse lunged forward, breaking into a fast climb up the ridge trail, and every man in the rocks above tensed at once, weapons rising, breath held, because the moment for words had ended. The first shot came from below, fast, precise, chipping rock inches from Amos's position, forcing him to duck lower behind cover. Roy's shotgun answered, thunderous, the sound rolling out across the open ridge like a physical blow. Lash's horse shied hard, throwing his aim wide. Down, Walt shouted, and Nora dropped flat behind the rocks as a second shot cracked past, close enough to spray grit across her cheek. Caleb rose slightly, pistol steady despite the chaos, and fired twice in quick succession, the 2 years of training finally finding purpose in exactly the moment none of them had expected it to serve. Lash's horse went down hard, throwing him clear, and for a moment the ridge fell into a strange ringing silence, broken only by the horse's panicked scrambling, and the distant echo of gunfire rolling off across the empty hills. "Report," Walt called. "Sharp, urgent." "Clear," Amos answered. "Clear," Roy echoed. Caleb, breathing hard, nodded once, wordless. Below, Corbin Lash rose slowly from where he'd fallen, favoring one arm, pistol still gripped in his other hand, eyes scanning the rocks above with cold, calculating fury. "You're better prepared than I expected," he called up, voice tight with pain and something colder underneath. "Ashford didn't mention you'd have allies." "Ashford," Walt called back, "didn't know we'd figure out the truth in time. That's the difference between careful planning and actual understanding, Mr. Lash. One accounts for what you expect. The other accounts for what you missed." Lash's jaw tightened, visible even from this distance. "Doesn't change the outcome," he called. "I've got a job. Job doesn't end just because you've gotten clever." He raised his pistol again, and Walt's whole body tensed, ready. A shot rang out. Not from the ridge. From behind Lash. From the tree line, sudden and unexpected, dropping the killer hard to his knees before he could even turn to identify the source. Every head on the ridge snapped toward the new threat. A figure emerged from the trees, pistol still smoking, hands shaking visibly even from this distance. Ward Collins. The deputy stood over Lash's fallen form, face pale, chest heaving, looking down at what he'd just done like he couldn't quite believe his own hands had done it. "Ward?" Roy called down, disbelieving. Ward looked up toward the ridge, and even from this distance, Walt could see the particular kind of exhaustion carved into his face. The look of a man who had spent the last hour running from a choice, only to find the choice waiting for him at the end of the road anyway. "I heard him talking," Ward called up, voice unsteady. "About the job. About the Ashfords." He swallowed hard. "About the $2 I took this morning, and what it actually bought." Nobody spoke. "I told myself it was nothing," Ward continued, voice cracking. "Told myself watching a shop for a couple hours wasn't the same as being part of whatever happened after. Told myself a lot of things. Riding out of town after your friend caught me listening." His eyes dropped to Lash, groaning now on the ground, wounded but alive. "Couldn't tell myself any of it anymore, once I heard him say it plain. Once I understood what my silence was actually paying for." Walt made his way down the ridge slowly, revolver holstered now, watching the deputy with careful, measured eyes. "You could have kept riding," Walt said, reaching the bottom, standing a careful distance from where Lash lay wounded. "Could have let this play out without you in it at all." "I know," Ward said, quiet, ashamed. "Spent about 10 miles telling myself exactly that." He looked up, meeting Walt's eyes directly for the first time. "Couldn't do it. Man's got to live with himself eventually. And I didn't much like the man I'd have had to live with if I'd kept riding." Roy joined them now, shotgun lowered, studying Ward with an expression caught somewhere between anger and something closer to reluctant respect. "This doesn't erase this morning," Roy said. "The $2. The silence." "No," Ward agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing erases that." His voice steadied slightly. "But it's a start. And starts are usually the only thing a man's actually got control over once the damage is already done." Corbin Lash groaned again, shifting weakly against the ground, blood spreading dark across his shoulder where Ward's shot had caught him. "You'll hang for this," Lash spat, weak but venomous. "Shooting a man in the back." "You were about to shoot an unarmed man in a fair fight you'd already lost," Ward said, cutting him off, voice hardening now with a conviction that hadn't been there moments before. "And you work for a family that spent 2 years manipulating a grieving son into nearly murdering an innocent farmer, all so they could steal his land once the dust settled." He crouched down, closer, cold. "I don't think any judge in this territory is going to lose much sleep over how exactly you ended up on the ground." Caleb approached slowly now, Nora close beside him, both of them staring down at the man who had spent 2 years quietly orchestrating the worst grief of Caleb's already grief-stricken life. 2 years, Caleb said, voice shaking with something between fury and heartbreak. 2 years you fed me details about brothers I never even met. Made me believe every word of it was about honor, about family." His hands curled into fists. "It was never about that at all, was it?" Lash's eyes, glassy with pain, flicked up toward him, something almost like pity moving across his face. "Kid," he said, weak, breathless. "It was never personal for me. Just business. You were a tool. Convenient. Motivated." A ragged laugh escaped him. "Should be almost flattered. Took real skill, keeping a man that angry for that long, pointed exactly where we needed him pointed." Caleb's whole body shook. Rage and grief tangled together in a way that made the air around him feel dangerous, unstable. "Caleb." Walt's voice steady, cutting through. "Don't. He used me," Caleb said, voice breaking. "Used my brother's deaths. Used my whole life. Everything I thought mattered. Just so I know," Walt said. "And he'll answer for it. In front of a judge. In front of the whole territory. Once this story gets told the way it actually happened." His eyes held Caleb's, steady, understanding. "But not like this. Not with you standing over him with murder still burning in your hands. Because if you do that, son, then whatever he built you into for the last 2 years, that's the version of you that wins. And you'll carry that a lot longer than you'll carry the satisfaction of it." Caleb stood frozen a long moment, chest heaving, fists still clenched. Then slowly, terribly slowly, something in him released. His shoulders dropped, his hands unclenched. "Fine," he said, voice hollow. "Fine." Nora's hand found his, squeezing tight, and Caleb let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 entire years. Amos moved forward now, businesslike, pulling rope from his saddlebag, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had bound plenty of prisoners in his time. "We'll need to get him back to town," Amos said. "Proper custody. Proper record. This needs to be documented right, or Ashford's lawyers will bury the whole thing before it ever sees a courtroom." "I'll take him," Ward said, quiet, determined. "It's the least I owe this town, after this morning." Roy studied him a long moment. "You understand what happens next. Once this comes out. Your job. Your reputation. Understand," Ward said. "Understood it about 10 miles back, when I finally stopped running from it." His eyes hardened, resolve settling into his face like something long overdue. "Some debts, Mr. Whitfield, you don't get to negotiate the price of. You just pay them, and hope it's enough." They bound Lash's wounds carefully, roughly, efficiently, the wounded man's protests growing weaker as shock and blood loss caught up with him. Ward loaded him onto his own horse, grim and businesslike, preparing for the long ride back toward town and whatever reckoning awaited on the other side of it. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the group finally made their way back down from the ridge. The immediate danger past, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly giving way to something quieter, heavier, and altogether more exhausting. Walt walked beside Caleb in silence. For a while, the two of them leading their horses down the last stretch of trail toward Larkspur Hollow, neither quite ready yet to fill the space between them with words. "I don't know what to feel," Caleb said finally, voice rough with exhaustion. 2 years I knew exactly what I felt, exactly what I was working toward now. He shook his head. Now there's just this. Emptiness, where the purpose used to be. Walt's chest tightened with recognition, because he knew that particular emptiness intimately, had lived inside it himself, 14 years ago, standing in a doorway looking at a dead wife's rocking chair, understanding for the first time that finishing a hunt doesn't fill the hole the hunt was meant to fill. "I know that feeling," Walt said quietly. "Better than almost anyone alive, probably." "How do you live with it?" Caleb asked, the emptiness. Walt was quiet a long moment, considering the question with the same care he'd have given a difficult stretch of trail. "You don't fill it," he said finally. "Not all at once. Not ever, completely. You find small things. Ordinary things. A horse that needs feeding. A fence that needs mending. A friend who shows up when it matters, even when you tell him not to." His eyes drifted briefly toward Roy, walking a few paces ahead. "You build a life around the hole, instead of trying to fill it. Eventually it stops feeling like the only thing that's there." Caleb absorbed that in silence, boots scraping against loose gravel. "My brothers," he said finally. "The ones you—" "Yes. Were they?" He struggled with the words. "Were they good men? Any part of them?" Walt considered the question carefully, honestly, the way it deserved to be considered. "No," he said finally. "I won't lie to you and say they were. What they did to my wife, to 9 other innocent people that night, there's no goodness that survives that kind of choice. He paused. But I'll tell you something else. Something I've thought about a great deal these 14 years. Men aren't born cruel. Something makes them that way. Circumstance. Choice, compounding on choice, until cruelty becomes the only shape they know how to be. His eyes met Caleb's, steady. You were raised apart from all that. Raised by a mother who understood exactly what that family could become, and worked hard to keep you from it. That's not luck, son. That's her, fighting for you, every single day, in ways you probably never fully understood until right now. Caleb's eyes glistened, something in his chest visibly loosening. She used to say that, he said, voice thick. Said blood doesn't decide who you become. Choices do. He swallowed hard. I spent 2 years trying to prove her wrong. Trying to prove that blood mattered more than anything else. And now? Walt asked. Caleb was quiet a long moment, looking out at the gold evening light spreading slow across the hills. Now I think, he said finally, she might have been right all along. They walked the rest of the way back to town, mostly in silence, the kind of silence that carries more weight and more healing than words ever could. By the time they reached the edge of Larkspur Hollow, the sun had dropped low enough to paint the whole street in deep orange, long shadows stretching across the packed dirt road, the town settling into the particular hush of early evening. Roy's shop came into view, familiar, ordinary, and something in Walt's chest ached at the sight of it, because that shop had held the whole shape of this impossible day, had held 14 years of grief, and one final confrontation that had somehow transformed, in the space of a few desperate hours, into something entirely different than either he or Caleb had ever expected. Not an ending. A beginning, though it would take time, still, for either of them to fully understand what exactly it was beginning toward. They gathered inside once more, the same corner where Walt had stood that morning, back against the wall, waiting for a death that had never come, except now the shop felt different, lighter somehow despite everything. Roy set glasses on the counter, 5 of them this time, and poured whiskey into each with hands that had finally fully stopped shaking. To surviving, he said, raising his glass. To second chances, Amos added, gruff but sincere. To truth, Ward said, quieter, still carrying the weight of everything he'd done and failed to do that day. Caleb and Nora raised their glasses together, wordless, something unspoken passing between them. Walt looked around the room at Roy, at Amos, at Ward, at Caleb and Nora standing close together, hands intertwined, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in 14 long years. Not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it, something close enough to matter. To Martha, he said quietly, raising his own glass. The room fell silent, respectful, understanding the weight carried in that single name. To Martha, they echoed and drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, a living burn. The kind that reminds a man he's still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something beyond grief. They stayed like that a while, the 5 of them, letting the exhaustion of the day settle slowly into something more like relief. It was Amos who finally broke the comfortable silence, setting his glass down with quiet finality. There's still the matter of Ashford, he said. The room sobered slightly at the reminder. Lash will talk, Ward said. Once he understands how deep the trouble he's in actually goes. Men like that, loyalty only runs as deep as self-preservation allows. And if he doesn't? Caleb asked. Then we've still got the letters, Nora said. The ones Corbin used to keep track of his payments. I copied what I could before I rode out to find you. She reached into her coat, producing a small folded bundle of papers, worn from the ride but intact. Names, dates, amounts. Enough, I think, to make even a judge friendly to Ashford money start asking questions he can't easily ignore. Roy took the papers, scanning them quickly, his expression darkening with each line. This is enough, he said slowly. More than enough. Walt watched the exchange, something settling into place in his chest. Because 14 years ago, when he'd ridden out after the first of the Vane brothers, he'd believed, with the simple absolute certainty of raw grief, that justice was a thing one man could deliver alone, with nothing but a gun. and enough patience to see it through. He understood now, watching this room full of unlikely allies, a deputy finally choosing conscience over convenience, a young woman who'd risked everything to save a man she loved, an old scout who'd spent 30 years learning to read the true shape of danger, a shop owner who'd carried an old debt quietly for 14 years and finally found a way to repay it, that justice, real justice, was rarely something a man managed alone. It was something built, carefully, out of people willing to show up when showing up cost them something. "There's one more thing," Walt said, and something in his voice made the room go quiet again. He reached into his coat, drawing out the leather pouch he'd carried all day, the one filled with bullets he'd counted, one by one that morning, preparing for a death he'd been certain was coming. He set it on the counter. 14 years, he said slowly. "I've carried this, or something like it. Different pouches, different bullets, but always the same weight." His eyes moved around the room, settling finally on Caleb. "I don't think I need to carry it the same way anymore." Caleb watched him, uncertain. "What does that mean?" he asked. Walt considered the question a long moment. "It means," he said finally, "that I've spent 14 years believing the only way to honor Martha was to keep hunting, keep hurting, keep the weight sharp enough that I never forgot exactly what was taken from me." He paused, throat tight. "But watching you today, watching a young man nearly destroy himself chasing the same kind of weight, for reasons that weren't even fully his own, I understood something I probably should have understood a long time ago." "What?" Caleb asked again, softer this time. "That carrying grief like a weapon doesn't honor the person you lost," Walt said. "It just makes sure their absence keeps causing damage, long after they're gone. Martha wouldn't have wanted that. Not from me, and I don't imagine your mother wanted it from you either." The room had gone completely still, everyone listening, understanding they were witnessing something rare and important. "So what do we do instead?" Caleb asked, voice barely above a whisper. "If not carry it." Walt looked down at the pouch of bullets on the counter, at 14 years of grief distilled into something small enough to hold in one hand. "We live," he said simply, "as well as we're able. We let the people we lost matter through how we choose to go on, instead of through how much damage we're willing to cause, trying to balance a scale that was never going to balance anyway." Nora's eyes glistened, and she squeezed Caleb's hand tighter. Roy cleared his throat, thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Walt," he said, "you know you're welcome to stay in town, as long as you need." Walt considered the offer a long moment, something warm moving through his chest. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I think, after all this, I'd like to see my own land again. Been away from it too long, chasing ghosts." "And the Ashfords," Amos said. "They'll fight this. Land that valuable, family that powerful. They won't just walk away because we've got some papers and a wounded gunman willing to talk." "No," Walt agreed. "They won't. But they've made a mistake today, one I don't think they anticipated." "What's that?" Ward asked. Walt's eyes moved around the room, settling on each face in turn: Roy, Amos, Ward, Caleb, Nora. "They assumed grief makes people easy to control," he said. "Assumed if you feed a person's pain carefully enough, you can point them wherever you want, and they'll never once think to ask who's really benefiting from where they're being pointed." His jaw tightened. "But grief, real grief, eventually asks questions, eventually wants the truth more than it wants the satisfaction of a simple villain to blame. And once it starts asking those questions, it doesn't stop," Caleb finished quietly, "until it finds real answers." Walt nodded once. "That's exactly right." They talked long into the evening after that, working through the details, how best to present the evidence, who among the territorial judges could be trusted to hear the case fairly, what protection Ward's testimony would need against a family with the kind of money and reach the Ashfords commanded. It was well past dark by the time the group finally began to disperse, each of them carrying a piece of the day's exhaustion. But also, Walt noticed something else, something lighter, something that looked, unmistakably, like the early shape of hope. Roy walked him to the door, as the others said their goodbyes, promising to reconvene in the morning to begin the long, careful work of bringing the truth fully into the light. "You did something remarkable today," Roy said quietly, standing in the doorway of his shop, the same doorway Walt had walked through that morning, believing himself hours from death. "We did something remarkable," Walt corrected. "None of it happens without you. Without Amos. Without a scared young woman brave enough to ride 3 days to save a man. Everyone else had already decided was a monster." Roy smiled, tired but genuine. 14 years, Walt. I've been waiting 14 years to find some way to pay back what you did for me on that mountain." "You don't owe me anything," Walt said. The same words he'd said that morning, though they carried different weight now, softened by everything that had happened between then and now. "I know you believe that," Roy said. "But I think, after today, I finally understand what you meant. All those years ago, when you said the debt gets paid through living well, instead of through grand gestures." His eyes were warm, sincere. "You showed up for me once, in a storm neither of us expected to survive. Today I got to show up for you. That feels like the debt finally settling itself, in the only way debts like that ever really can." Walt held his gaze a long moment, something thick and grateful sitting heavy in his chest. "Take care of this town, Roy," he said finally, "and take care of those 2 boys. Dale, Nate. They've got more in them than they know yet." "I will," Roy promised. "You take care of that farm. And maybe," he hesitated, then pushed forward anyway, "maybe come visit more than once every 14 years. Walt allowed himself something rare, a small, genuine smile. "I think I might just do that," he said. He rode out of Larkspur Hollow that evening, under a sky full of stars, the events of the day settling slowly into something he could begin to carry, not as a fresh wound, but as one more chapter in a long, complicated life that had somehow, against every expectation, found its way towards something like peace. The ride home took most of the night, the moon rising high and pale over empty hill country, casting long silver light across the road, stretching out ahead of him. Because sometimes a man needs the quiet of a long ride to properly understand what's just happened to him. Sometimes the mind needs miles, and darkness, and the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth, to finally process a day too large to fit inside any single conversation. Walt thought about Martha as he rode, thought about the particular sound of her humming, off-key, while she worked, thought about the rocking chair still sitting by the window of his farmhouse, exactly where she'd left it 14 years ago. He thought, too, about Caleb, about the particular loneliness of grieving people you never even had the chance to know, about the terrible weight of discovering that your own pain had been carefully cultivated by strangers for profit. And he thought, finally, about the pouch of bullets he'd left behind on Roy's counter that evening. 14 years of wait set down at last. Not because the grief was gone. Grief like that never fully leaves a man. But because he had finally understood, watching a young stranger nearly destroy himself chasing the same ghost gets, that, carrying the weight forever had never actually been the way to honor what he'd lost. Living was. Living and showing up and choosing, again and again, mercy over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been so much easier. He reached his farm just before dawn, the familiar shape of the house rising dark against the lightening sky, the barn beyond it silent and still. He stood outside for a long moment before going in, looking at the place that had held both the best and worst years of his life, understanding, for the first time in 14 years, that he was ready to let it hold something new as well. He pushed the door open. The house smelled the way it always had: old wood, dried herbs, the particular quiet of a home that has stood empty too long. He lit a lamp, and its glow spread warm across the small front room, illuminating Martha's rocking chair by the window, her sewing basket still resting on the shelf beside it. He crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, the one he rarely opened anymore, and pulled out the bottom drawer where he kept the few possessions that had survived that terrible night 14 years ago. A ring, a small daguerreotype, her face soft and young and smiling, and beneath them, folded carefully, a letter he hadn't read in over a decade. He'd found it among her things, months after the funeral, tucked inside a book she'd been reading before everything ended. He'd read it once, that first terrible year, and then folded it away, unable to face what it contained a second time. He opened it now, hands steady despite the exhaustion of the day, and read Martha's careful, familiar handwriting by lamplight. "Walter, I've been meaning to tell you something, and keep losing my nerve, so I am writing it instead, the way I always do when the words won't come out right spoken aloud. Do you remember the woman who came through with the vain wagon train 3 summers back? Before any of the trouble started, before any of it went bad. Her name was Ruth, I believe, though I never learned her last name for certain. She was traveling with her youngest boy, a baby not yet a year old, and her husband had already left them somewhere back along the trail, unwilling to keep providing for a family that reminded him too much of a life he no longer wanted. I gave her what supplies we could spare. Sat with her an evening, listening to her worry over what kind of life that baby might have, given the family he'd been born into's on his father's side. She told me that night that she intended to raise him apart from all of it, change her name, keep him far from whatever violence ran through his father's blood. I told her I thought that was a brave choice, and a wise one. I think of her sometimes and that baby, and wonder what became of them. I hope wherever they are that she succeeded. I hope the boy grew up gentle, despite everything working against him. I love you more than these pages could ever properly say." Martha Walt sat very still for a long time after reading it, the lamp flickering low, the words settling slowly through him with a weight he hadn't expected. Because Martha had known, long before the raid, long before any of the grief and violence that would eventually consume both their lives. She had sat with a frightened young mother, offered kindness without hesitation or judgment, and hoped, genuinely hoped, that the woman's baby might grow up free of the cruelty that ran through the rest of his family. That baby had been Caleb. Walt was certain of it, certain in the particular way a man becomes certain of things that finally completely make sense. After years of confusion, Martha had shown kindness to Caleb's mother, years before any of the tragedy that would come to define both their lives. And that kindness, planted so long ago, had somehow, impossibly, found its way back around through grief, through violence, through 14 years of hunting and one final, unexpected reckoning to help produce exactly the outcome Martha had hoped for that evening. A boy raised apart from cruelty. A boy who, when finally faced with the choice between vengeance and mercy, had chosen mercy. Walt held the letter a long time, tears finally coming, quiet and unhurried, the particular grief of understanding that his wife's kindness had outlived her by 14 years, rippling outward in ways neither of them could have possibly imagined that ordinary summer evening. He would tell Caleb, he decided. Not right away. Not until the dust of everything else had settled, until Ashford's schemes had been properly answered for, until Caleb and Nora had begun building whatever life came next for them. But eventually, he would tell him, would let him know that his mother's choice to raise him gentle, apart from his family's violence, had been quietly validated years before either of them ever met, by a woman neither of them would ever get the chance to properly thank. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it back into the drawer, and sat for a long while, in the growing light of dawn, watching the sun rise slow and gold over land that had been his and Martha's together, and was now, somehow, beginning to feel like his alone, in a way that didn't hurt quite as sharply as it once had. The following weeks unfolded with the particular slowness of consequences, finally catching up to actions long delayed. Corbin Lash, faced with the full weight of evidence Nora had gathered, chose cooperation over loyalty, providing testimony that implicated the Ashford family directly in a scheme to manipulate both Caleb and Walt toward mutual destruction. The territorial judge, a stern, unbending man named Harlan Beecher, who had built his reputation on refusing exactly the kind of influence Ashford money typically wielded, took the case personally, determined to see it through properly. Ward Collins testified as well, admitting fully and publicly to the $2 he'd accepted, to the silence he'd nearly maintained, to the moment of conscience that had finally, belatedly, sent him riding after Lash instead of continuing to look the other way. He lost his position as deputy, as everyone had expected he would. But something unexpected happened. In the aftermath, the town of Larkspur Hollow, rather than condemning him entirely, seemed to recognize something valuable in a man who had chosen, eventually, to correct his own failure rather than simply live with it. He took work at the livery instead. Quieter work, less power, but more honesty, and seemed, in the months that followed, considerably more at peace with himself than he had been wearing a badge that had asked more of his conscience than he'd been prepared to give. The Ashford family fought the accusations fiercely, exactly as Amos had predicted, throwing considerable resources into discrediting the testimony against them. But truth, once it finally begins moving, has a particular momentum that money struggles to fully contain. More witnesses came forward. More documentation surfaced. The careful architecture of manipulation Ashford had built around Caleb's grief, once exposed to daylight, proved far too extensive and far too damning to simply disappear. By late autumn, the family's holdings had been significantly reduced, their reputation across the territory badly damaged, their ability to pursue similar schemes elsewhere effectively ended. It was not, Walt reflected, a perfect justice. The men who had orchestrated the scheme would likely never face the kind of reckoning their actions deserved. Money, even diminished money, still brought a particular kind of protection that raw truth alone couldn't fully overcome. But it was enough that Walt's land remained his own. Enough that Caleb and Nora could begin building a life together, without Ashford's shadow hanging over every decision. Enough that the truth, however incomplete its final justice, had at least been spoken plainly in a courtroom before witnesses who would carry the story forward. Caleb visited the farm that winter, arriving unannounced on a cold, clear morning with Nora beside him, both of them bundled against the chill. Walt met them at the door, something warm moving through his chest at the sight of them. "Didn't expect visitors," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite of disappointment. "We were passing through," Caleb said, though something in his expression suggested the visit had been more deliberate than that. "Wanted to see the place. If that's all right." Walt studied him a moment, understanding immediately that there was more to the visit than idle curiosity. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on." They sat around the small kitchen table, the same table Walt had shared countless meals at with Martha, and for a while the conversation stayed light, easy, the particular comfortable rhythm of people who had survived something together and found, in that survival, an unlikely but genuine bond. It was Nora who finally raised the question they'd clearly come to ask. "We're getting married in the spring," she said. "Small ceremony. Just close friends." Her eyes met Walt's, careful, hopeful. "We'd like you to be there, if you'd come." Walt's chest tightened with an emotion he hadn't fully expected. "I'd be honored," he said, voice thick. Caleb cleared his throat, something clearly still weighing on him. "There's something else," he said. "Something I've been meaning to ask since that day." "What's that?" "My mother," Caleb said carefully. "You said before that you understood something about how she raised me, apart from my father's family. I've wondered since then what exactly you meant by that." Walt was quiet a long moment, deciding, finally, that this was the right moment for the truth he'd been carrying since that dawn months ago. He rose, crossed to the small writing desk, and retrieved Martha's letter, worn now from repeated reading, the creases soft with handling. He set it on the table in front of Caleb. "Read this," he said. "I think it belongs to you now, more than it belongs to me." Caleb read it slowly, carefully, his expression shifting through confusion, then recognition, then something raw and overwhelming as understanding fully arrived. His voice broke. "This is my mother. This has to be my mother." "I believe it is," Walt said gently. "Your wife," Caleb said, voice thick with emotion, "showed my mother kindness. Years before any of this, before the raid, before any of the grief that shaped both our lives. She did," Walt confirmed. Caleb sat very still, tears finally breaking free, running silent down his face, as he processed the full weight of what the letter revealed. "She hoped I'd grow up gentle," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "despite my family's blood, despite everything working against it." "She did," Walt said again, softer now. "And I did," Caleb said, something breaking open in his voice, relief and grief, and profound gratitude all tangled together. "Eventually, after 2 years of nearly becoming exactly what she hoped I wouldn't, you chose mercy," Walt said. when vengeance would have been so much easier. I think that's exactly the gentleness she was hoping for. Nora reached across the table, taking Caleb's hand, tears in her own eyes now as well. Your mother and Walt's wife, she said softly, found each other, briefly, years before any of us existed in each other's lives. And somehow, impossibly, that kindness found its way back around to save us both. The four of them sat together a long while after that, the weight of the discovery settling slowly, gently, into something that felt less like grief, and more like a strange, unexpected gift, proof that kindness, once offered, rarely disappears entirely, even when its full impact takes years, sometimes decades, to finally become visible. Spring arrived, and with it, the wedding Nora had promised. It was a small affair, held in the same gun shop that had witnessed the beginning of their strange, complicated story, Roy insisting, with an emotion that surprised even himself, that the shop deserved to witness its ending as well as its terrible beginning. Walt stood among the small gathering of guests, watching Caleb and Nora exchange vows in front of people who had, against every expectation, become something like family in the months since that terrible Tuesday morning. Amos stood nearby, weathered face soft with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Ward Collins, quieter now, more thoughtful, stood at the back of the small crowd, still carrying the weight of his earlier failure, but standing taller, somehow, for having finally corrected it. And near the front, watching with unabashed pride, stood Dale and Nate, the two young men who had mocked Walt that first morning, and who had, in the months since, become something entirely different from who they'd been. Roy had told him weeks earlier about the change in them, how Dale had grown quieter, more thoughtful, spending long hours asking Roy questions about honor, about respect, about the difference between confidence and cruelty. How Nate had begun standing straighter, speaking more carefully, clearly working to become someone worthy of the story he'd witnessed unfold in his own workplace. Walt caught Dale's eye across the small gathering, and the young man offered a small, respectful nod and acknowledgement, unspoken but unmistakable, of exactly how much that ordinary Tuesday morning had changed him. Walt nodded back, because that, he understood now, watching Caleb and Nora complete their vows, watching Roy wipe unashamed tears from his weathered face, watching two young men, who had once mocked an old farmer, stand now with genuine respect, and understanding that was the truest kind of legacy a man could hope to leave behind. Not vengeance, however justified it might once have felt. Not the weight of 6 graves, scattered across 3 territories, however necessary they had once seemed. But this, mercy chosen freely, rippling outward through people who might never have learned it any other way. After the ceremony, as the small gathering began to disperse into the warm spring evening, Caleb found Walt standing alone near the shop's front window, looking out at the same street, where months earlier he had stood waiting for what he'd believed would be his final hour. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, joining him. "For everything. For choosing to listen, that day, instead of simply reaching for a gun." "You did the same," Walt said. "That's what made it possible." They stood together a while in comfortable silence, watching the evening settle gold and warm over Larkspur Hollow. "What will you do now?" Caleb asked finally. "Now that it's all settled, the land secured, Ashford answered for, as much as they're likely to be." Walt considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things these days, slowly, thoughtfully, no longer rushing towards certainty the way grief had once demanded of him. "I think," he said finally, "I'll go home. Tend the land. Maybe, eventually, let it become something other than just a museum to what I lost." His eyes drifted, briefly, towards some middle distance only he could see. Martha would have wanted that, I think. Would have wanted the place to hold new life again, instead of just old grief. "Will you be alone?" Caleb asked, careful, gentle. Walt smiled slightly, something warm and unhurried moving through his weathered features. "For now," he said. "But I've learned something, these past months. Alone doesn't have to mean lonely. Not if a man's willing to let people in when they show up wanting to matter." His eyes moved to Caleb, warm with genuine affection. "You and Nora, you're welcome any time. Amos, even Ward, if he's willing to make the ride." I've spent 14 years keeping the world at arm's length, telling myself it was safer that way. He shook his head slowly. I don't think safer's actually what I was chasing. I think it was just easier than admitting how much I still had to lose. Caleb studied him a long moment, understanding fully now the particular courage it had taken for a grieving farmer to finally set down 14 years of armor, to finally allow himself, once again, the vulnerability of caring about people who might, someday, leave him too. That's the bravest thing you've done, Caleb said quietly. Braver than any of the fighting. Walt considered that, and found somewhat to his own surprise that he agreed. Maybe it is, he said. They stood together a while longer, watching the last light of evening fade slow and gold over the quiet street. Two men shaped by the same terrible tragedy from opposite directions, who had somehow, against every expectation, found their way towards something that looked unmistakably like healing. Because that, in the end, was the truest resolution any of them could have hoped for. Not a clean ending, not a story where every wound closes perfectly, where every debt settles exactly even, where justice arrives complete and unblemished. Just people, doing their best, choosing mercy where mercy was possible, choosing truth where truth mattered, and building slowly, imperfectly, something worth calling a life out of the wreckage grief had left behind. Walt rode home that evening under a sky, just beginning to fill with stars, the weight he'd carried for 14 years lighter now than it had been in longer than he could properly remember. He thought of Martha, as he always did on quiet rides like this one. Thought of her kindness, offered so long ago to a frightened young mother she'd never see again. Kindness that had somehow, impossibly, rippled forward through 14 years of grief and violence to help produce, in the end, exactly the mercy she'd hoped for. He thought of Caleb and Nora, beginning their life together with a truth, finally, fully understood. He thought of Roy and Amos, and even Ward people who had shown up, when showing up mattered most, and in doing so had transformed an old debt of grief into something considerably more valuable. And he thought, finally, of the two young men who had mocked him that first morning, and who had, in the months since, learned something about honor and mercy that would likely stay with them the rest of their lives. That, Walt understood now, riding home beneath a sky full of stars toward a farmhouse that no longer felt quite so much like a museum, was the real legacy of everything that had happened. Not the 6 graves he'd left scattered across 3 territories, all those years ago. Not even the 7th reckoning, so nearly become an 8th grave, that had instead become something entirely different. But this, the quiet rippling proof that kindness, once given freely, rarely disappears entirely, that it waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, for exactly the right moment to finally fully matter. He reached his farm well after dark, the familiar shape of the house rising warm against the star-filled sky, and for the first time in 14 long years, walking through that door felt less like returning to grief and more like coming home.